Hi guys, tonight we walk beside the slow brown waters of the Yellow River, where the earliest stories of China begin in mud, smoke, sacrifice, and exhausted human hands. The night air feels cool against your skin, somewhere nearby. Reeds bend softly in the wind, water slides past in heavy silence, carrying silt from distant mountains. The river smells alive, damp earth, wet clay, rotting plants pulled loose by floods. It is not a gentle river even now, thousands of years later. It still carries an old reputation for sudden cruelty. You stand beside a settlement protected by packed earth walls. Dogs bark in the distance. A child coughs somewhere beyond the firelight. Above you, stars appear between drifting smoke from cooking fires and kiln furnaces. Bronze workers remain awake long after sunset. Their labour never fully ends. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, perhaps share your location, your local time, and what part of history you enjoy most. There is something strangely comforting about strangers listening together in the dark. Now, dim the lights. You move slowly through the settlement, careful not to step into shallow drainage ditches cut beside narrow pathways. The houses sit low against the earth. Their walls are made from mud brick and timber frames. Roofs sag beneath bundles of straw. Nothing here is grand yet. Nothing announces empire. But empire is already waiting. The people living beside this river do not know they stand at the beginning of one of humanity's longest continuous civilizations. They're mostly concerned with more immediate problems: floods, harvests, illness, ancestors, whether the millet stores will survive another winter. A woman kneels beside a grinding stone, working grain into coarse flour. Her sleeves are rolled above tired wrists. Smoke from the nearby hearth clings to her hair. She does not speak much tonight. Her younger son developed a fever 2 days earlier, and no one yet knows whether he will survive. Life here often hangs by thin threads. You hear pigs squealing from wooden pens. Chickens scratch through refuse near the homes. The smell of animal waste mixes with cooking broth and damp soil. Human beings adapt quickly to strong smells. That may be one of history's less glamorous truths. The rulers of these early kingdoms claim divine approval. They speak of heaven, ancestors, cosmic order. But power still depends on grain storage, bronze weapons, and frightened loyalty. Some things never really change. In the distance, drums echo softly. A ritual is beginning. You follow a narrow path toward a raised ceremonial platform near the settlement centre. Torches flicker in the wind. Shadows stretch across carved wooden posts blackened by smoke and age. Several nobles stand wrapped in layered robes dyed with precious pigments. The cloth feels heavy even from a distance. Thick silk does not breathe well beside summer fires. Ancient nobility suffered for fashion just as faithfully as modern people do. At the centre stands a diviner holding an oracle bone. The bone has been polished carefully. Questions are carved into its surface. Harvest predictions, military concerns, royal births, requests for guidance from ancestors long buried beneath the earth. The diviner presses heated metal against the bone. Cracks spread sharply. Everyone watches in complete silence. The dead still govern the living here. Ancestors are not memories. They are active forces. The boundary between spiritual reverence and political authority barely exists. Kings rule partly because they claim access to invisible approval. You notice the faces surrounding the ceremony. Some look fearful. Others look exhausted. One young servant struggles to stay awake after hours of preparation. His eyes keep drifting shut before he jerks himself alert again. History often survives through tired people carrying objects from one room to another. The Shang kings rule much of northern China during this period. Their authority stretches across fortified cities connected by tribute, warfare, and ritual obligation. Bronze technology gives them enormous military advantages. Their chariots thunder across battlefields with terrifying speed. But beyond the controlled territories lie many other peoples, rival communities, nomadic groups, independent settlements. The world remains fragmented. Rain begins lightly. You smell wet ash and cooling earth. Servants rush to cover ceremonial vessels before water fills the engraved interiors. One nobleman complains quietly about mud staining his robes. Another stares upward nervously. Storms can carry divine meaning. Or perhaps human beings simply become superstitious whenever nature reminds them how powerless they truly are. The ceremony continues. Animals are sacrificed. Wine is poured. Bronze bells ring softly through the night air. And somewhere beyond the walls, ordinary farmers sleep beside their tools, unaware that future historians will call this the cradle of Chinese civilization. The phrase sounds noble centuries later. Reality feels colder. You walk farther from the ceremonial fires and follow the edge of cultivated fields. Millet sways gently under moonlight. Irrigation ditches reflect silver light between rows. The labour required to maintain these fields never ends. Children help before they fully understand why. Old men continue working despite swollen joints and bent backs. Civilization grows from repetition. Planting, harvesting, repairing walls, digging graves, carrying water. Again and again, a young farmer pauses beside the field edge and rubs mud from his hands. He looks toward the distant noble compounds with unreadable eyes. Respect, perhaps. Resentment, perhaps. Ancient societies rarely leave emotional diaries from ordinary people. Historians reconstruct their feelings through fragments. Still, some emotions hardly require translation. Fear of hunger, love for family, quiet anger toward distant rulers. Hope that tomorrow may feel easier. The wind strengthens slightly. You hear wooden shutters tapping against house frames. Far beyond these settlements, new dynasties wait unborn. Philosophers remain centuries away from writing their ideas. The Great Wall does not yet exist. Neither does the vast imperial bureaucracy people later associate with China. For now there is simply the river. The river controls everything. When floods arrive, entire communities disappear beneath brown water and drifting timber. Survivors rebuild because there is nowhere else to go. The fertile soil always pulls people back. Even grief becomes cyclical here. You stop beside the riverbank again. Moonlight breaks across the slow current. Insects hum through reeds nearby. Somewhere in the darkness, a bronze worker still hammers metal beneath torchlight. The sound travels faintly across the water. Clang! Then silence. Clang! Then silence again. And you begin to sense something enormous forming beneath these scattered kingdoms and fragile ceremonies. Not yet an empire. Not yet a unified civilization. More like a long memory slowly teaching itself permanence. Dynasties will rise here. Palaces will burn here. Poets will write beside these waters. Armies will drown crossing them. Children will play beside them centuries apart without knowing how many lives came before. For now, though, the night remains simple. Wet earth, smoke, river water. Human beings trying to survive long enough to see another harvest. And somewhere above the drifting clouds, unseen stars continue their patient movement over ancient China. Morning arrives beneath a pale sky the colour of worn silk. You wake to the sound of wagon wheels grinding against frozen earth. Oxen snort clouds into the cold air. Somewhere beyond the city walls, labourers are already shouting at one another before sunrise. Ancient governments discover early that exhaustion becomes easier to manage when people remain too busy to think clearly. Centuries have passed since the Shang kings questioned cracked oracle bones beside the Yellow River. Dynasties have risen and fallen. Wars have spread across the land like recurring fever. Small kingdoms swallowed neighbouring states until only a handful remained. Now you stand in the age historians later call the Warring States period. China feels fractured, suspicious, and endlessly tense. Every ruler fears invasion. Every border fort watches the horizon. Roads fill with soldiers, tax collectors, refugees, wandering scholars, and merchants carrying news nobody fully trusts. And among the Western kingdoms, one state grows harder than the others. Qin. The air inside the Qin capital tastes of coal smoke and iron. Black banners move stiffly in the winter wind above fortified walls. The streets feel disciplined rather than lively. People walk quickly here. Conversations stay short. Faces remain careful. You notice the silence first. Not complete silence. No city ever achieves that. But a controlled quiet, the kind created when harsh laws shape daily life. Even market arguments seem restrained, as if everyone fears speaking one sentence too many. A woman selling steamed millet cakes keeps glancing toward passing officials. Her hands move quickly despite the cold. She counts copper coins twice before hiding them inside her sleeves. Tax burdens in Qin grow heavier every year. The state demands grain, labour, military service or obedience. Mostly obedience. The kingdom's rulers believe human beings become useful only through strict control. Mercy appears dangerous to them. Softness invites weakness. Weakness invites chaos. You pass a public punishment platform near the market square. A man kneels there with lowered head while officials read accusations aloud. Nearby citizens avoid staring too long. One child peeks from behind his mother's robe anyway. Human curiosity consistently survives authoritarianism. Probably because people secretly hope disaster belongs only to someone else. The condemned man crime sounds minor to modern ears. Missing labour quotas, failing administrative expectations. But the Qin state measures loyalty through productivity. The sentence is severe. No one protests. By now, the ruler guiding this hard kingdom is a young king named Ying. History will remember him differently. Later generations call him Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. Even the title feels ambitious enough to disturb the heavens. At first, he appears almost ordinary from a distance. A man walking palace corridors beneath hanging lanterns while advisors bow low around him. Yet entire civilizations sometimes pivot around individuals with relentless focus. Not necessarily kindness, not wisdom either, simply focus sharpened into obsession. And Qin Shi Huang possesses that quality in frightening abundance. You enter the palace compound through enormous gates reinforced with bronze fittings, cold enough to sting your fingers. Guards stand motionless beside tall pillars lacquered black and red. Their armour smells faintly of leather oil and damp wool. Inside, scribes work late into the night copying reports from distant provinces. Bamboo strips pile across wooden desks beneath flickering lamps. Military dispatches, grain records, construction updates, lists of punishments, lists of taxes, lists of dead soldiers. Empires begin with paperwork almost as often as battles. The emperor studies maps constantly. You watch him standing beside a long table weighted with carved stones against curling parchment edges. Rivers twist across the maps like veins. Mountain ranges divide territories not yet fully subdued. Rival kingdoms still resist Qin authority. But not for long. Campaign after campaign pushes outward. Qin armies move with terrifying efficiency. Roads improve, supply systems strengthen, bronze weapons become standardized. Officers receive promotions through military achievement rather than noble birth. Merit sounds admirable until you remember it also creates highly organized conquest. Outside the capital, ordinary conscripts march through bitter weather carrying spears and heavy packs. Some are farmers only weeks removed from harvest labour. Their boots split open in muddy roads. Their hands bleed from cold iron weapon shafts. One soldier keeps a tiny cloth doll hidden beneath his armour, sewn by his younger sister before departure. He pretends not to miss home. Most soldiers do. You walk beside the marching column for a while. Frost crunches underfoot. Breath hangs white in the air. Someone coughs continuously near the rear ranks. Nobody stops moving. The Qin military machine consumes people steadily. Victories arrive anyway. One kingdom falls, then another. City walls burn, noble families flee eastward, royal courts collapse into panic and betrayal. Some rulers surrender peacefully, others fight until palace roofs collapse around them. Accounts from the period describe rivers clogged with corpses after major battles. Historians debate exact numbers, ancient chroniclers often exaggerated. Still, the violence was enormous. Unification carries a heavy sound. It sounds like iron striking shields, like horses screaming during battle, like exhausted men digging mass graves before winter freezes the ground. Eventually the wars end. For the first time, much of China stands unified beneath one ruler. Qin Shi Huang declares himself emperor rather than king. The distinction matters deeply to him. Kings belong to older eras. He intends something larger, permanent, cosmic. You stand among gathered officials during one imperial procession. Silk banners ripple overhead. Incense smoke drifts through cold morning air. Drums beat slowly enough to resemble a heartbeat. The emperor passes in a high carriage surrounded by armed guards. People kneel immediately. Some bow from genuine awe, others from fear. Usually the two emotions overlap inside powerful states. The new empire begins reshaping itself almost immediately. Weights become standardized. Currency becomes standardized. Written characters become standardized. Roads spread outward from the capital like tightened threads pulling distant territories inward. Even axle widths for carts become standardized. There is something strangely intimate about authoritarian control reaching all the way to wheel measurements. Yet beneath the harshness lies genuine transformation. Trade improves. Communication improves. Vast regions previously divided by warfare suddenly connect through shared systems. People who once saw themselves as separate kingdoms gradually begin imagining something larger. China. Still, unity demands enormous cost. Forced labourers flood construction projects across the empire. Defensive walls expand across northern frontiers. Foundations of what later generations call the Great Wall. Workers haul stone through freezing mountain passes. Many never return home. You pause beside one labour camp at dusk. Smoke from cooking fires barely cuts the cold. Men sit silently with bowls of thin millet porridge balanced between cracked hands. Their shoulders slump from exhaustion. Nearby, an overseer checks supply tallies beneath a lantern light. One worker removes his shoes carefully before sleeping. His feet are bleeding badly. He wraps them anyway. Tomorrow will require walking again. No glorious speech survives for him. History mostly remembers emperors, but empires are built from anonymous suffering layered carefully beneath monuments. Night settles heavily across the Qin world, inside his palace. Qin Shi Huang grows increasingly obsessed with immortality. Power rarely feels sufficient once obtained. The emperor fears death intensely. He sends expeditions searching for magical islands and eternal medicines. Alchemists promise impossible solutions. Some later accounts claim mercury poisoning worsened his paranoia. Historians still debate details. Either way, fear begins tightening around the imperial court. Executions increase. Suspicion deepens. Books are burned. Scholars disappear. The emperor who unified China now struggles to control time itself. And time, as always, remains undefeated. The earth opens slowly beneath grey morning rain. You stand on a hillside outside the Qin capital where thousands of labourers move through wet clay in exhausted silence. Their boots sink deep into mud. Wooden carts creak downhill beneath heavy loads of soil. Water drips steadily from woven straw hats. Nobody complains loudly anymore. Complaints waste breath, and breath already feels precious here. Below the hillside, hidden beneath layers of earth and timber, an emperor prepares for eternity. Or at least he tries to. Qin Shi Huang grows older now. Not peacefully older, restless older, suspicious older. The sort of aging that keeps palace servants awake at night because every conversation feels dangerous. Inside the imperial residence, corridors smell faintly of incense and medicinal herbs. Alchemists move carefully between guarded chambers carrying powders, strange minerals, and expensive promises. One court physician kneels beside lacquered boxes filled with mercury compounds believed to prolong life. The irony hangs quietly in the air. The emperor consumes immortality one poison dose at a time, yet outside the palace, the greatest monument of his fear already spreads beneath the ground. You descend toward the construction site through cold drizzle. The scale becomes difficult to comprehend at first. Trenches stretch outward in enormous rectangular grids. Workshops hammer continuously through the rain. Kilns burn day and night. The entire landscape feels transformed into one giant wound carved into the earth. Thousands of workers live nearby in temporary camps. The smell reaches you before the voices do. Wet straw, wood smoke, sweat trapped inside damp clothing, boiling grain soup stretched too thin. A young labourer sits beside a shallow fire, rubbing warmth into swollen hands. He cannot be older than 17. Mud stains every layer of his clothing. His fingernails are packed with clay that never fully washes away. He stares toward the distant burial mound without expression. Perhaps he feels pride, perhaps resentment, perhaps only exhaustion. Ancient records rarely preserve the private thoughts of people forced into monumental labour. Their emotions vanish unless someone powerful happened to notice them, and powerful people rarely noticed enough. You continue downhill toward the workshops where sculptors shape terracotta soldiers in endless rows. The atmosphere changes there, less chaotic, more concentrated. Artists bend over unfinished figures beneath open-sided shelters, while rain taps softly against wooden roofs overhead. The soldiers begin as separate parts. Heads, hands, arms, legs. Then workers assemble them carefully before firing the completed figures in massive kilns. Each face carries subtle differences, different hairstyles, different expressions, different ages. Some appear stern, others thoughtful, a few almost look tired. That detail unsettles you most. Even in clay, human fatigue survives. One sculptor smooths the moustache of an officer figure using wet fingertips. He pauses occasionally to flex stiffness from his wrists. Nearby, another worker mutters quietly about cracked pottery ruined during firing. Months of labour lost because temperature control failed overnight. The empire demands perfection from everyone, even from clay. Rainwater gathers in shallow puddles between workshop foundations. You hear coughing somewhere nearby. A supervisor shouts inventory numbers over the sound of hammering tools. Oxen drag timber toward deeper excavation chambers beneath the tomb complex. Nobody fully understands the emperor's complete plans. Rumours spread constantly through the labour camps. Some claim entire rivers of mercury flow beneath the tomb. Others whisper about mechanical traps designed to kill intruders automatically. Crossbows hidden behind sealed doors, poisonous chambers, secret maps of the empire recreated underground. Historians still debate how much is true. No clear agreement survives. The central burial chamber itself remains unopened even in modern times. Archaeologists worry excavation could damage priceless materials before preservation methods improve. So the emperor still waits underground, sealed inside uncertainty. There is something strangely fitting about that. You pass a line of prisoners carrying baskets of earth suspended from shoulder poles. Chains clink softly against wet stone. Their punishment sentences have become construction labour. One older prisoner limps badly but keeps moving anyway. Guards notice weakness quickly here. The tomb project consumes enormous resources. Grain, timber, bronze, human lives. Entire villages contribute labour quotas. Families lose sons for years at a time. Some never return. Stories circulate about workers buried alive to preserve tomb secrecy after construction phases ended. Historians argue over those accounts too, though brutal practices certainly existed within Qin rule. The deeper you walk into the site, the stranger the atmosphere becomes. It no longer feels entirely human. Rows of unfinished terracotta soldiers stand beneath covered shelters awaiting kiln firing. Rain drips down their faces. Some lean slightly sideways before final adjustments. In dim light, they almost resemble silent crowds watching your movements. Thousands of eyes without life. Thousands of expressions frozen before death. An artisan wipes clay from his sleeves and studies one completed figure carefully. He adjusts the soldier's ears with surprising tenderness. That small gesture lingers in your mind. Even under harsh empires, people still try to create beauty. Night approaches early beneath heavy clouds. Lanterns glow across the construction grounds one by one. Fires flicker through rain mist. Workers gather around cooking pots speaking softly about home villages far away. One man describes pear trees beside his family courtyard. Another remembers river fishing during childhood summers. Ordinary memories become precious under difficult lives. You sit beside the edge of the excavation while distant thunder rolls across the hills. Below you, countless clay soldiers wait beneath the earth in military formation. Archers, infantry, charioteers, officers, an underground army prepared for an emperor unwilling to travel into death alone. The loneliness inside absolute power begins revealing itself here. Qin Shi Huang commands the largest empire China has yet seen. Entire populations obey his decrees. Roads stretch outward under his authority. Mountains echo with the labour of his projects, yet none of it quiets his fear. Not the armies, not the walls, not the ceremonies, not even this enormous tomb. You imagine the emperor late at night inside guarded chambers, listening to wind against palace roofs. Perhaps he thinks about assassination, betrayal, spirits, aging flesh. Perhaps he lies awake wondering whether history remembers rulers kindly or cruelly. Maybe he simply fears disappearing. Most human beings do. The rain finally weakens near midnight. Clouds drift apart slowly above the burial mound. Moonlight touches wet earth and scattered pools of standing water. The terracotta soldiers remain motionless in darkness beneath your feet, and somewhere inside the palace, the emperor continues searching desperately for more time while the years close quietly around him. He cannot see it yet, but his dynasty will collapse astonishingly fast after his death. Empires often appear eternal right before they break. For now, though, the fires still burn across the hillside. Labourers still shape clay faces by lantern light. Guards still patrol muddy roads with bronze weapons glistening damp beneath the moon. And beneath layers of packed earth, an entire silent army waits patiently for a master who will never truly escape mortality. The road west smells of horse sweat, wet leather, and dust carried across impossible distances. You travel beneath a pale dawn sky while merchants tighten saddle straps beside long caravans preparing to leave the Han frontier. Bells tied to mule harnesses ring softly in the cold air. Guards inspect spearheads. Someone curses quietly while trying to relight a stubborn cooking fire. The Qin Empire is gone now. It collapsed beneath rebellion, chaos, and accumulated hatred only years after Qin Shi Huang died. His vast machinery of control proved too heavy to sustain itself. Peasants revolted. Generals turned against one another. The imperial court dissolved into panic and bloodshed. Out of the violence emerged a new dynasty, Han, and under the Han emperors, China begins breathing differently. Still powerful, still ambitious, but less suffocating than Qin rule, at least for a while. The capital city of Chang'an spreads wide beneath defensive walls and crowded market districts. Unlike the tense silence of Qin streets, Han cities feel more alive. Vendors shout openly now. Children run through alleyways carrying sticks and scraps of cloth as improvised toys. Scholars argue loudly in tea houses about morality, governance, and proper ritual conduct. Human beings return quickly once fear loosens slightly. You pass beneath painted wooden gates into a market thick with noise and smells. Sesame oil crackles in iron pans. Fresh noodles steam in baskets. butchers chop meat against worn wooden blocks darkened by years of use. A woman selling silk fans laughs so hard at a customer's joke she nearly drops her entire display into the mud. Nearby, a government clerk carefully pretends not to smile. Confucian scholars now influence much of imperial thinking. The Han rulers prefer order shaped through moral duty rather than pure terror. At least officially. Reality still contains prisons, executions, corruption, and political paranoia. Empires never become gentle simply because philosophers write elegant sentences. Still, the atmosphere changes. Education matters more now. Family lineage matters deeply. Scholarship becomes a path toward influence, and China begins looking outward. You leave the capital along roads stretching west toward frontier territories where imperial authority thins into uncertainty. Soldiers patrol watchtowers built against nomadic raids. Wind moves constantly across the dry grasslands. Dust settles into clothing seams and never fully leaves. At night, campfires burn low against the cold. One frontier soldier sits sharpening his blade beside glowing embers. He has not seen his family in 3 years. His daughter was learning to speak when he departed eastward from home. Now she probably runs through courtyards already. He wonders whether she still remembers his face. Frontier service carries loneliness, unlike battlefield fear. Days pass quietly. Then suddenly arrows arrive from empty horizons. The Han Empire faces constant pressure from the Xiongnu Confederation to the north. Mounted nomadic warriors move swiftly across open terrain difficult for settled agricultural states to control. Diplomacy alternates with warfare. Marriage alliances alternate with betrayal. History rarely chooses one mood for long. You continue westward with a caravan carrying silk bolts, lacquerware, iron tools, and delicate ceramics packed carefully between layers of straw. Camels grunt impatiently while handlers load supplies beneath pale morning light. This is the beginning of what later generations call the Silk Road, though the name sounds smoother than reality ever felt. The routes crossing Central Asia remain dangerous and fragmented. Traders face bandits, storms, political instability, disease, freezing mountain passes, and endless uncertainty. Most merchants never travel the entire distance themselves. Goods change hands repeatedly across connected networks stretching toward Persia, India, and eventually the Roman world. Still, movement has begun, and movement changes civilizations. You ride beside a middle-aged merchant whose beard has started turning grey around the chin. He smells faintly of smoke and medicinal herbs. Small scars cross his hands from years handling ropes and animals. He speaks several languages badly but confidently. That combination has powered international trade for centuries. At dusk, the caravan stops beside a frontier outpost where walls creak under desert winds. Soldiers warm themselves around dung fires while travellers exchange news over bowls of thin soup. Stories drift between languages and accents. A rebellion in some distant valley. Flooding near the Yellow River. A caravan lost crossing mountain snow. An unusual Roman glass cup seen far westward. The world slowly feels larger now. Inside China, Han society grows increasingly sophisticated. Paper begins appearing in more widespread forms. Government bureaucracy expands. Historians record court life carefully. Astronomers track celestial movements with obsessive precision. Yet ordinary people still wake before sunrise, worrying about taxes and harvest weather. You visit a farming village during late autumn. Dry cornstalks rustle softly in the wind. Chickens scatter across packed dirt courtyards. Smoke rises from low chimneys carrying the comforting smell of garlic and millet porridge. An elderly grandfather repairs a wooden rake beside his doorway while grandchildren chase one another nearby. Their laughter cuts cleanly through the cold air. For a moment, empire feels very far away. Then an official arrives carrying tax records. Everything changes slightly when authority enters a village. Conversations shorten. Smiles become cautious. The official himself looks tired rather than cruel. He rides a thin horse with patch saddle straps and keeps rubbing warmth into stiff fingers. Administration exhausts everyone involved. Inside the imperial court, however, ambition grows more refined. Silk robes whisper across polished floors. Scholars debate philosophy beneath hanging lanterns. Musicians play soft melodies during banquets where powerful officials study one another carefully between cups of warmed wine. You notice how often people bow while hiding their real thoughts. A court attendant pours wine for an aging minister whose hands tremble almost invisibly. The minister worries younger rivals are already positioning themselves against him. Influence inside imperial politics never remains stable for long, neither does affection. One emperor becomes fascinated with immortality practices much like Qin Shi Huang before him. Another withdraws emotionally into palace pleasures while advisors compete for attention. Human weaknesses survive every dynasty. Even golden ages contain sleepless nights. You walk through Chang'an again during spring festival celebrations. Lanterns glow red across crowded streets. Musicians play flutes beneath hanging banners. Foreign traders mingle beside Chinese nobles. Buddhist travelers, stable workers, silk weavers, and wandering storytellers. Perfume drifts through the evening air alongside roasted chestnuts and spilled wine. The empire feels confident now. Perhaps too confident, because prosperity always carries hidden fragility. Landowners grow wealthier while poor farmers struggle under mounting debts. Court factions sharpen quietly behind ceremonial politeness. Eunuchs begin gaining influence inside palace walls. Military commanders along distant frontiers accumulate dangerous power. Most people do not notice these cracks yet. That is another repeating truth of history. Civilizations often appear strongest shortly before uncertainty begins spreading beneath the surface. Still, tonight Chang'an glows beautifully beneath the lantern light. You pause beside a bridge where reflections shimmer across dark canal water. Somewhere nearby, a young scholar recites poetry awkwardly to impress someone listening from behind a silk fan. He is trying far too hard. Some things also never change. And above the crowded capital, beyond the palace roofs and drifting festival smoke, the roads of the Han world continue stretching outward into darkness, carrying silk, ambition, loneliness, and human dreams farther than anyone once imagined possible. The palace wakes before dawn. You hear it first through layers of muffled sound drifting along dark corridors. Sandaled footsteps against polished stone. Quiet coughing behind closed doors. The soft scrape of broom bristles across courtyards still wet from night rain. Then comes the distant ringing of bronze bells. Not loud, never loud inside the inner palace. Power here prefers restraint. Raised voices suggest instability, and instability frightens imperial courts more than almost anything. You walk beneath covered passageways lined with red, lacquered pillars still smelling faintly of fresh oil. Lantern flames tremble behind silk screens. Eunuchs move silently through the half-light carrying trays of hot water, folded robes, sealed documents, bowls of herbal medicine. They know every corridor, every servant, every whispered rumour. And because they know so much, everyone fears them a little. The Han court has grown enormous now. Layers of administration spread through the empire like roots beneath the soil. But inside the palace itself, another quieter system operates entirely through proximity. Who enters the emperor's chambers? Who pours his wine? Who hears his private frustrations? Who notices which concubine receives invitations too frequently? Empires are governed partly through armies and taxes, but also through doors opening softly at night. You pass through an inner courtyard where rainwater gathers beneath flowering plum trees. Several young palace maids kneel beside stone basins washing silk garments in cold water. Their fingers have turned red from the temperature. One girl suppresses a yawn so suddenly she almost drops an embroidered sleeve into the mud. She arrived here only months ago. Her family likely celebrated the appointment, Service within the imperial palace sounds honourable from distant villages. Parents imagine safety, prestige, opportunity. They rarely imagine loneliness. The palace isolates people strangely. Thousands live within its walls, yet nearly everyone feels watched and alone. A senior eunuch named Liang walks slowly through the corridor ahead of you. His robes remain immaculate despite the wet morning air. He carries himself carefully, almost weightlessly, as though every movement has been rehearsed for decades. Other servants bow immediately when he passes. Liang began palace service as a child. He remembers little of his original home now beyond the smell of river mud after rain. The palace became his entire world long ago. Its rhythms shape his breathing. Its dangers sharpen his instincts. He trusts almost nobody, reasonably so. Inside the emperor's private residence, incense smoke curls upward beside carved wooden screens painted with mountain landscapes. Musicians tune instruments softly in a neighbouring chamber, while physicians discuss herbal treatments in hushed voices. The emperor himself looks exhausted today. He sits near an open window watching rain slide from roof tiles into the courtyard below. Silk cushions support his back. A half-finished cup of medicinal broth cools untouched beside him. Ruling an empire appears glamorous from a distance. Up close it often resembles chronic fatigue surrounded by ceremony. Memorials from provincial governors await review, flood reports from the south, tax disputes, military concerns along the frontier, corruption accusations against regional officials. The paperwork never ends. A concubine enters quietly carrying fresh tea. Her sleeves brush softly against the floor as she kneels. She's young enough that traces of nervousness still remain visible around her eyes. The emperor thanks her absent-mindedly, without fully looking up. Yet even tiny interactions matter here. Other women inside the palace notice everything. Which concubine receives eye contact? Which receives gifts? Which remains ignored for weeks? Affection becomes political currency within imperial households. Rivalries form slowly beneath perfect manners. You move farther into the women's quarters where embroidered curtains soften the morning light into muted gold. The air smells pleasantly of sandalwood, cosmetics, and damp silk drying near braziers. Several concubines gather around a game board, though conversation remains cautious. One woman laughs lightly at a joke, then immediately glances toward nearby attendants to measure reactions. Nobody entirely relaxes here. A favoured concubine can elevate her entire family through imperial children. She can also disappear abruptly if accused of manipulation, disloyalty, or simply falling from favour. The emotional atmosphere feels exhausting. One older woman sits quietly near the window, embroidering cranes into pale blue silk. She once enjoyed tremendous influence during earlier years of the emperor's attention. Now, younger women occupy the centre of court fascination. She handles the transition with outward grace. Inside, perhaps differently. History rarely records the private grief of fading importance. Outside the palace walls, Chang'an continues buzzing with ordinary life. Merchants negotiate prices. Farmers unload produce carts. Scholars debate philosophy in crowded tea houses. But within these guarded compounds, tiny shifts in mood can alter national politics. A powerful eunuch supports one prince over another. A concubine whispers criticism against a rival minister. A servant overhears confidential discussions while refilling wine cups. Information drifts through palaces like smoke beneath doors. You enter the archive chambers where clerks copy official records onto bamboo slips and early paper documents. Ink stains their sleeves permanently. Lamps burn late into the night here. One tired scribe rubs his eyes before continuing a report concerning grain shortages near the western provinces. He has copied characters so long his fingers cramp during sleep, yet his work preserves history itself. Without exhausted clerks, entire dynasties vanish into silence. Rain stops near midday. Moisture clings to the stone courtyards while sunlight finally breaks through clouds above the palace roofs. For a brief moment, Everything looks strangely peaceful. Then a rumor arrives. One of the Emperor's sons may be gathering allies too aggressively among military officials. Nothing openly treasonous. Not yet. Still, tension spreads immediately through the inner court. Conversations shorten, eunuchs move faster through corridors carrying sealed messages, ministers request urgent audiences. You feel the atmosphere tighten almost physically. That is the strange thing about imperial politics. Massive events often begin as whispers exchanged beside tea trays. By evening, musicians perform during a formal banquet held beneath hanging lanterns glowing amber against dark lacquered beams. Dancers move gracefully across polished floors while officials compliment one another with practiced politeness. The emperor smiles occasionally, but many eyes keep drifting toward the princes seated farther down the hall. Everyone calculates constantly here. Who seems confident? Who appears nervous? Who drinks too much wine? Who avoids certain conversations? A young servant accidentally spills warm broth across an official's robe. The room freezes briefly. The servant trembles so badly he nearly collapses. Then the official simply sighs. Perhaps he's too tired for cruelty tonight. The relief spreading across the servant's face feels almost painful to witness. Later, long after the banquet ends, the palace quiets again beneath drifting moonlight. Eunuchs extinguish lanterns one by one along empty corridors. Somewhere distant, a woman cries softly behind closed doors. Somewhere else, guards change watch positions with muffled footsteps and jingling armor straps. You stand beneath the night sky inside the silent courtyard and realize something important about these vast dynasties. Empires are not truly held together by marble, armies, or laws alone. They are held together by fragile human relationships. Trust, fear, desire, resentment, loneliness. And inside these palace walls, those emotions grow sharp enough to shape history itself. Summer heat settles heavily over the late Han Empire. The air inside Luoyang feels thick enough to drink. Dust clings to sweaty skin. Flies circle market refuse beside crowded streets where merchants fan themselves beneath faded awnings. Even the dogs lying in narrow patches of shade appear exhausted. You move slowly through the capital while distant thunder rolls somewhere beyond the city walls. Rain threatens, but never quite arrives. People glance upward hopefully anyway. A good storm could save crops. A bad storm could ruin everything. The empire has entered one of those uneasy periods when ordinary conversations begin sounding tense, without anyone fully explaining why. Food prices rise quietly. Bandits appear more frequently along roads. Officials blame one another during court sessions. Tax collectors grow harsher. And beneath the polished rituals of imperial authority, something exhausted begins to crack. Inside the palace, banquets continue almost every evening. Musicians pluck soft melodies from silk-stringed instruments, while dancers turn gracefully beneath hanging lanterns. Wine pours constantly into lacquered cups. Perfumed smoke drifts through the chambers in pale ribbons. The emperor seems distracted tonight. One eunuch whispers jokes beside his chair, earning tired laughter. Another refills wine before being asked. The palace inner circle has become crowded with men who understand how to survive through charm, information, and careful manipulation. Many officials deeply resent them. You sit near the rear of the banquet hall watching ministers exchange controlled smiles across low tables stacked with roasted meats, fruits, and steaming rice dishes. The food smells wonderful. Ginger, garlic, sweet wine sauce caramelizing against hot platters outside the palace walls. Meanwhile, farmers struggle through drought conditions. History often contains this uncomfortable split screen. Luxury in one room, desperation in another. A court scholar named Chen keeps his face carefully neutral while musicians perform nearby. He despises the growing power of palace eunuchs, but understands the danger of speaking openly. Several outspoken officials have already disappeared into prison cells or forced exile, so Chen bows politely, drinks wine politely, survives politely. At least for now. Beyond the capital, the countryside suffers badly. You travel eastward through villages where dry fields stretch beneath hazy skies. Millet crops wilt in the heat. Wells sink lower each week. Farmers study the horizon, constantly searching for signs of rain. An old woman kneels beside cracked earth crumbling between her fingers. She does not cry. Perhaps she already finished crying weeks ago. Nearby, her grandson gathers thin bundles of firewood from the land once dense with vegetation. His ribs show beneath loose clothing. Hunger has begun reshaping bodies quietly across the provinces. Yet taxes still arrive on schedule. Imperial officials continue demanding grain quotas many villages can barely provide. Local magistrates fear punishment from higher authorities if collection falls short. So pressure moves downward through every level of society until it finally crushes the people least able to resist. A village headman apologizes softly while recording confiscated grain stores. His own family will likely struggle through winter too. Nobody here truly controls events anymore. That realization spreads slowly through the empire like illness. You continue along crowded roads where displaced families travel with ox carts piled high with blankets. Tools, cooking pots, sleeping children. Some move towards cities hoping for work. Others flee bandit violence or flooding in neighbouring regions. The empire feels restless now. At night, refugee camps flicker beside the roads beneath smoky cooking fires. Conversations drift through darkness in tired murmurs. One man claims local spirits have abandoned the dynasty. Another blames corrupt ministers. A third simply stares into the flames without speaking at all. Exhaustion eventually becomes larger than ideology. And then rebellion begins finding fertile ground. You first hear whispers about a healer named Zhang Jue moving among desperate villages preaching salvation and cosmic renewal. He promises relief from suffering, healing from illness, a transformed world freed from corruption. The movement spreads quickly because hopeless people often cling hardest to certainty. Followers wear yellow cloth around their heads, the yellow turbans. At first, the imperial court dismisses them as another rural disturbance. Minor unrest happens constantly across large empires, but reports keep multiplying. Entire communities join. Local officials vanish, storehouses burn, armed bands gather openly. By the time the court fully understands the danger, rebellion has already erupted across enormous stretches of northern China. You arrive near one shattered town shortly after fighting ends. Smoke still rises from collapsed buildings. Chickens wander through abandoned courtyards. A broken cartwheel turns slowly in muddy water beside the road. The smell hits hardest. Burned timber, wet ash, blood. Imperial soldiers move through the ruins searching for survivors and hidden rebels. Most look frighteningly young beneath their armour. One boy cannot stop staring at a dead civilian lying near the marketplace well. He keeps swallowing hard as if trying not to be sick. No training fully prepares people for civil war. The Han government responds with overwhelming force. Regional generals receive expanded authority to suppress rebellion quickly. Armies mobilize across the empire. Executions multiply. Entire regions descend into chaos. The Yellow Turban Uprising eventually weakens, but the damage remains irreversible. Because in order to crush rebellion, the imperial court empowers military commanders far beyond previous limits, and powerful generals rarely surrender authority peacefully afterward. You begin hearing new names repeatedly now. Cao Cao, Liu Bei, Sun Jian, men who currently appear as regional figures navigating collapsing order. Later generations will transform them into legends through novels, operas, poems, and endless retellings. But for now they remain very human, ambitious, frightened, clever, sometimes ruthless. The emperor himself grows increasingly isolated inside palace walls, while competing factions battle for influence around him. Eunuchs plot against officials, officials plot against eunuchs. Generals watch everything carefully. Trust evaporates. One humid evening, violence finally explodes inside the capital itself. Armed forces loyal to rival factions flood the palace grounds. Fires spread through administrative buildings. Horses scream in crowded courtyards. Servants flee carrying whatever valuables they can grab. You run through smoke-filled corridors where overturned lanterns spill flame across silk curtains. Somewhere nearby, metal clashes against metal in sudden bursts of panic. The Imperial Palace no longer feels eternal. It feels fragile. A terrified young servant hides beneath a stairwell, clutching a small carved charm against his chest. He whispers prayers to ancestors between shaking breaths, while footsteps thunder overhead. History remembers dynastic collapse through names and battles. Living through it feels smaller, more immediate. Smoke in your lungs, fear in your stomach, not knowing whether dawn will arrive peacefully. By morning, parts of the palace stand blackened and ruined beneath drifting ash. Bodies lie scattered across courtyards once used for elegant ceremonies. Surviving officials already begin calculating new alliances, because even during collapse, politics continues. You stand beside the damaged outer wall, watching soldiers march through the ruined gate beneath grey skies. The Han Dynasty still officially exists, but something essential has already broken. The empire that once stretched confidently across East Asia now trembles beneath corruption, rebellion, military ambition, and accumulated exhaustion. Ordinary people sense it first. They always do, and far beyond the smoke rising over the wounded capital, ambitious warlords begin preparing for the long struggle ahead. Rain falls for 3 straight days across the broken roads of northern China. Everything smells damp. Wet horse blankets, rotting straw, cold mud churned beneath marching boots. You travel beside an army moving through the chaos left behind after the Han collapse. The empire still exists on paper, but paper means very little once central authority dissolves into competing warlords and frightened regional governors. The world has narrowed into survival again. Villages fortify themselves with crude wooden barriers. Farmers hide grain underground. Families sleep lightly, listening for hoofbeats at night. Somewhere beyond the rain-covered hills, 3 rival powers slowly emerge from the wreckage. Wait. Woo! The period later generations call the 3 Kingdoms begins not with heroic music, but with exhaustion. You pass columns of refugees dragging carts through knee-deep mud. Children wrapped in soaked blankets stare silently as soldiers move past. An old man struggles to keep a broken wheel attached with rope and splintered wood. Nobody looks certain where safety exists anymore. Inside military camps, however, ambition burns brightly. You arrive near the headquarters of Cao Cao, one of the era's most formidable commanders. His camp stretches across muddy plains, beneath rows of dark banners snapping in the rain. Horses stamp impatiently beside supply wagons. Messengers ride constantly between command tents carrying sealed orders protected inside oilcloth. Cao Cao himself moves quickly despite the weather. He's not physically imposing in the way legends later prefer. No glowing aura, no perfect heroic posture, just sharp eyes, constant calculation and relentless energy. He understands something many rivals do not. Food wins wars almost as reliably as swords. Granaries matter, roads matter, discipline matters. Inside his command tent, maps lie weighted beneath bronze cups and dagger handles while officers debate troop movements late into the night. Candle smoke thickens the air. Wet cloaks steam near braziers. One advisor argues for caution, another demands immediate attack. Cao Cao listens quietly before making decisions and clips sentences. He rarely wastes words. Outside the tent, ordinary soldiers crouch beside smoky fires, cooking millet gruel inside blackened pots. One young recruit carefully dries a letter from home over the flames after rain soaked it during the march. He cannot fully read the characters himself. A friend reads it aloud quietly. His mother writes about autumn harvests and missing him terribly. She also reminds him to keep his feet dry whenever possible. Mothers across history remain wonderfully practical even during civil collapse. The soldier laughs softly at that line, then grows silent again. War during the Three Kingdoms period feels endless. Alliances shift constantly. Cities change hands. Brothers fight on opposite sides. Oaths sworn beside wine cups dissolve beneath political necessity, yet people continue searching for loyalty anyway. You travel southward along the Yangtze River where another leader, Sun Quan, consolidates power in the lands that later form the Kingdom of Wu. The climate changes there. Humid air clings warmly to your skin. River mist drifts across broad waters crowded with military vessels and fishing boats alike. The south feels greener, softer, but no less dangerous. Boatmen pole through shallow reeds while watching the shoreline carefully for enemy scouts. Soldiers stationed along river forts repair crossbows beneath hanging lanterns swarmed by insects. One veteran sits sharpening a blade beside the docks. A long scar crosses his jawline nearly to the ear. He speaks quietly about northern campaigns during the Han collapse. Entire villages burning. Starving civilians stealing grain from corpses. Rivers carrying bodies downstream after battles. He says these things without drama. That may be the saddest part. Eventually human beings adapt even to horror. The kingdom of Shu rises farther west beneath the leadership of Liu Bi, a man later romanticized as the embodiment of virtue and loyalty. Historical reality appears more complicated. Though many contemporaries genuinely admired him, you meet weary soldiers marching through mountain passes under Shu banners. Their sandals scrape against steep stone paths slick with moss and rainwater. Supplies move slowly here. Every campaign through the region feels difficult. A soldier mutters that the mountains themselves seem loyal to nobody. Fair observation. Still, Shu inspires unusual devotion among many followers. Perhaps because Liu Bi projects sincerity during an age overflowing with betrayal. Perhaps because people desperately want to believe honourable leadership remains possible. Human beings hunger for moral clarity during chaotic times. That hunger never disappears entirely. One evening you shelter inside a crowded roadside inn packed with merchants, travellers, soldiers, and displaced families escaping nearby conflict zones. Rain drums heavily against the roof while steam rises from bowls of noodle soup carried between tables. The room smells of a garlic, wet wool, and rice wine. A travelling storyteller begins recounting famous battles beside the fire. Exaggerations already creep into recent history. Generals become larger than life. Clever strategies grow more dramatic with each retelling. You notice listeners leaning closer anyway. People need stories during uncertain eras. Stories help organise fear. Somewhere near midnight, thunder shakes the building hard enough to rattle ceramic cups. A child wakes crying briefly before her exhausted mother rocks her back asleep against her shoulder. Outside, the war continues unseen in darkness. Years pass this way, campaign after campaign, alliance after alliance, funeral after funeral. The famous Battle of Red Cliffs changes everything. Combined southern forces halt Cao Cao's massive northern army along the Yangtze through fire attacks and strategic brilliance. Or perhaps through weather, logistical problems, and human overconfidence. Historians still debate details beneath the legendary versions. Either way, the North fails to conquer the South. China remains divided. You stand beside the river after the battle while burned ships drift slowly downstream beneath cold morning fog. Ash floats across the water surface. The smell lingers everywhere. Charred wood, smoke, death hidden beneath river mist. A wounded soldier kneels beside the shoreline washing blood from his hands mechanically. He's been doing it for several minutes already. The water keeps turning red anyway. Nearby, crows gather in silence. The kingdoms survive for decades locked in fragile balance. Court politics grow increasingly intricate. Scholars continue writing poetry despite constant instability. Farmers continue planting crops beside battlefields. Life stubbornly continues even during fragmentation. That may be one of history's quiet miracles. You visit a small village during early spring where peach blossoms drift across irrigation canals, while children chase ducks beside flooded rice fields. For a moment, nothing about the landscape suggests civil war. Then distant drums echo faintly from somewhere beyond the hills. Everyone pauses briefly, just briefly, then work resumes, because people cannot remain frozen forever. Crops still require tending, roofs still leak during storms, infants still wake hungry before dawn. The Three Kingdoms era eventually becomes one of China's most beloved historical periods. Poets celebrate it. Novelists transform it into epic romance. Strategists study its campaigns endlessly, yet living through it mostly meant uncertainty. Cold camps, missing relatives, rumours travelling faster than facts, watching local rulers become legends while ordinary graves disappeared into the rain. And tonight, beneath another storm-dark sky, the roads of divided China remain crowded with soldiers marching toward futures nobody can clearly see. The north smells of smoke and horse sweat again. Another dynasty has fallen. The Three Kingdom period eventually ended, but unity did not last. New courts rose briefly before collapsing into fresh waves of invasion, migration, and political fragmentation. China now exists divided between northern kingdoms, ruled largely by non-Han elites and southern courts clinging to older traditions along the Yangtze. The old certainty of empire feels very far away. You stand beside a crowded river crossing at dawn watching refugees board overloaded ferries heading south. Chickens squawk from woven baskets. Infants cry against their mothers' shoulders. Wooden wheels creak beneath impossible stacks of belongings tied together with fraying rope. Most people carry too little. Some carry too much. Everyone carries fear. Cold mist hangs over the water while soldiers shout instructions nobody fully follows. Families become separated in the confusion. One elderly man keeps turning back toward the northern shore long after the boat begins moving. His ancestors are buried there. Leaving land behind in ancient China means more than relocation. It means breaking emotional geography. Graves matter deeply. Ancestral halls matter. Local rivers and mountains shape identity almost as strongly as language. Yet survival pushes people onward anyway. Northern China has become dangerously unstable. Nomadic and semi-nomadic groups establish kingdoms across territories once firmly controlled by Han dynasties. Armies sweep through vulnerable regions. Cities change rulers repeatedly. Agricultural systems strain beneath warfare and displacement. Some southern aristocrats dismiss northern rulers as uncivilized outsiders. Reality proves more complicated. You travel northward through one military settlement where cavalry officers train beneath sharp winter sunlight. Their horses appear smaller but tougher than many southern breeds. Fur-lined cloaks flap in the bitter wind. Archers practice firing while riding at full speed across frozen ground. The riders move beautifully. One commander laughs while correcting a younger recruit's posture. His accent sounds unfamiliar beside older Chinese dialects, shaped by frontier cultures mixing over generations. Around him stand soldiers whose families trace origins across many different peoples. History rarely remains ethnically neat for long. Inside northern capitals, rulers adopt Chinese administrative systems while preserving elements of their own traditions. Court ceremonies blend influences together awkwardly at first. Different clothing styles appear side by side. Languages overlap in marketplaces and military camps. Cultural adaptation often begins through practical necessity rather than idealistic harmony. You enter one northern city during late afternoon while snow drifts softly against fortified walls. Market streets bustle despite the cold. Butchers hang strips of frozen meat beneath awnings. Traders sell fermented milk beside Chinese grain wine. Buddhist monks pass mounted cavalrymen wrapped in animal furs. The world feels blended now, not peacefully blended, but undeniably connected. At a roadside tavern, travellers gather around a smoky fire pit warming numb hands over cups of hot broth. Conversations shift between languages you only partly recognize. A merchant complains about bandits. A soldier complains about officers. A monk quietly copies Buddhist sutras beside flickering lamplight. Human routines survive political collapse remarkably well. Further south, the atmosphere changes completely. The southern courts along the Yangtze cultivate refinement almost obsessively. Aristocratic families displaced from the north carry old cultural traditions into safer territories. Poetry flourishes. Calligraphy becomes deeply prized. Elegant conversation turns into a social art form. Perhaps refinement grows stronger whenever people fear losing civilization itself. You arrive in Jiankang, one of the southern capitals, during spring rain. Willow branches sway above canal waters while scholars drift through garden pavilions, discussing philosophy beneath wide silk sleeves. The city smells softer than the north. Tea leaves steaming in porcelain cups, wet bamboo, flowering plum trees after rain. Music drifts through open windows from private gatherings, where educated elites compose poetry while servants refill wine cups silently. Yet beneath the beauty lies deep anxiety. Southern dynasties remain politically fragile. Court factions compete endlessly. Generals along frontier regions accumulate dangerous influence. Emperors rise and fall quickly, and always, beyond the rivers. Northern armies remain a looming possibility. You spend one evening inside the estate of a prominent southern family. Lantern light reflects across polished floors while guests recline beside low tables covered with fruit, roasted fish, and delicate pastries. A scholar recites poetry comparing human life to drifting clouds. Everyone nods appreciatively. Then moments later, the same men begin arguing bitterly about military funding and regional defences. That contrast feels very human somehow. Civilized elegance on the surface, raw fear underneath. A young aristocratic woman walks alone briefly through the garden after the gathering quiets. Rainwater still clings to lotus leaves beside the pond. She pauses beneath a stone archway, listening to distant thunder. Her brothers serve in frontier armies. Her father navigates dangerous court politics. Marriage negotiations already surround her future, yet for one small moment she simply watches rain rings spreading across dark water. History moves through private silences too. Meanwhile, ordinary southern farmers continue transforming wetlands into rice fields through astonishing labour. You walk narrow raised paths between flooded paddies where workers bend waist-deep in water, transplanting young rice shoots beneath humid summer skies. The work looks punishing. Mud sucks at bare feet. Insects swarm constantly. Backs ache from endless bending. One farmer straightens slowly, pressing both hands against his spine before returning to work without complaint. Rice cultivation supports growing southern populations and gradually shifts China's economic centre southward over centuries. Quiet agricultural changes often matter as much as famous battles, possibly more. Buddhism also spread steadily during this divided age. Temples rise along trade routes and mountain valleys. Monks translate sacred texts from Sanskrit into Chinese with painstaking care. Wealthy families sponsor monasteries seeking spiritual merit and social prestige alike. You climb toward one mountain temple through drifting morning fog. Pine trees sway softly above stone steps darkened by rain. Bells ring faintly somewhere higher up the slope. The air smells clean, resin, wet moss, wood smoke from temple kitchens. Inside the monastery courtyard, novice monks sweep fallen needles into neat piles while older monks chant sutras in low rhythmic voices. A traveller kneels quietly before a small Buddha statue worn smooth by countless hands. Perhaps he prays for peace. Perhaps for lost family members. Perhaps simply for relief from uncertainty. This long-divided era reshapes China deeply. Peoples mix, religions spread, regional identities strengthen, old assumptions weaken. No single dynasty fully controls the land for centuries, and yet Chinese civilization survives. That resilience becomes visible everywhere you look. in scholars preserving texts through war, in farmers rebuilding irrigation channels after invasions, in mothers teaching children poems remembered from vanished hometowns. Empires fracture, roads collapse, palaces burn. Still, human beings continue carrying culture forward in smaller, quieter ways. Night settles over the southern riverlands now. Crickets sing through humid darkness beyond the rice fields. Lanterns glow warmly across distant villages reflected in black canal water, and somewhere far north beyond mountains and grasslands, cavalry fires flicker beneath cold stars while divided China waits patiently for unity to return once more. The mountain path disappears into fog before sunrise. You climb slowly through damp pine forests where every sound feels softened by mist. Water drips steadily from dark branches overhead. Your boots slide occasionally on worn stone steps polished smooth by centuries of passing feet. The world below seems far away here. No shouting officials, no military drums, no palace intrigue. Only wind moving through trees and the distant ringing of a temple bell somewhere higher on the mountain. China remains divided during these centuries, yet Buddhism continues spreading quietly across the fractured landscape. Merchants carry sutras along trade routes. Monks translate sacred texts by candlelight. Refugees displaced by war arrive at monasteries seeking food, shelter, or simply a few nights without fear, and increasingly, ordinary people begin searching for answers older traditions no longer fully provide. War exhausts belief systems too. You reach the monastery gates just as morning rain begins again. 2 stone lions stand dark with moisture beside weathered wooden doors inside the courtyard. Novice monks sweep fallen pine needles into neat circles, while smoke rises from the kitchen chimneys carrying the smell of rice porridge and boiling tea. The atmosphere feels calm but not luxurious. Monasteries survive through discipline, routine, patience. A senior monk named Dao Cheng welcomes travellers quietly beneath the covered walkway. His robe smells faintly of cedar smoke. Deep lines surround his eyes, though his expression remains gentle. He once served in a military camp as a teenager before abandoning that life after witnessing battlefield massacres along the northern frontier. He rarely speaks about those years directly. Some memories remain buried beneath silence instead of earth. Inside the temple hall, candles flicker before painted statues of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas, whose serene expressions seem untouched by worldly suffering. Incense thickens the air. Chanting begins softly from another chamber. Low voices, slow rhythm, steady breathing. The sound settles into your chest almost physically. Several villagers kneel nearby with clasped hands. One woman closes her eyes so tightly her entire face trembles. Her husband died during a regional conflict last winter. Her eldest son now struggles to maintain their farm alone. She does not ask the Buddha for wealth, only endurance. That may be one of the most ancient human prayers. You spend the day watching monastic life unfold in careful repetition. Monks copy sutras onto long scrolls using brushes held with extraordinary precision. Others tend vegetable gardens terraced along the mountainside. Younger novices haul water buckets uphill with strained shoulders and damp sleeves. Nothing dramatic happens, and yet the quiet itself feels meaningful. In a world shaped by dynastic collapse and military ambition, monasteries offer something rare: predictability, reflection, temporary refuge from endless political turbulence. Not perfect refuge, of course. Temples depend on donations from wealthy patrons and regional rulers. Rival schools of Buddhism debate fiercely over doctrine and authority. Some monasteries accumulate enormous wealth while nearby peasants remain hungry. Human institutions rarely escape human contradictions. Still, the spiritual hunger spreading across China during these centuries feels genuine. You sit beside Dao Cheng beneath an open pavilion overlooking fog-covered valleys. Rain taps softly against roof tiles overhead, while he prepares tea with practiced movements. He speaks quietly about suffering, not in grand philosophical language, in practical observations. People cling tightly to things that disappear. Power fades, Beauty fades, dynasties fade. Even grief changes shape over time. Below the mountain, distant villages appear briefly through drifting fog before vanishing again. Impermanence surrounds everything. You think about the emperors buried beneath massive tombs, the warlords who believed military victories could secure permanence, the aristocrats preserving elegant traditions inside fragile courts. And here, high in the mountains, monks spend hours meditating on the simple truth that nothing lasts. There is something almost rebellious about that idea. Far from the monastery, Buddhism also transforms daily life in more ordinary ways. Temples establish orphanages and charitable food distributions during famines. Pilgrims travel dangerous roads seeking sacred sites. Artists paint vast cave murals illuminated by butter lamps flickering against stone walls. You journey westward toward the famous cave temples near Dunhuang along the Silk Road corridors. The desert air feels completely different there. Dry wind stings your face. Sand gathers inside clothing folds. Camels groan beneath loaded packs while caravan bells echo across empty distances. Yet even here, far from imperial capitals, Buddhist culture flourishes beside trade routes connecting China with Central Asia and India. Inside the caves, torchlight dances across painted walls covered with celestial figures. Merchants, monks, musicians, and scenes from Buddhist stories. The colours still glow astonishingly bright. Deep reds, soft blues, gold leaf-catching flamelight. An artist balances carefully atop wooden scaffolding, applying delicate brushstrokes to a bodhisattva's robe. His hands move steadily despite the heat trapped inside the cave chamber. He tells you he has worked here 14 years. 14 years painting compassion onto stone walls beside the desert. There are worse ways to spend a life. Outside, caravans continue arriving from distant regions carrying silk, spices, precious stones, manuscripts, and rumours from lands most Chinese villagers will never see. A Sogdian merchant laughs loudly while bargaining over horses. A weary monk from India searches for translators. A Chinese official complains about sand damaging his boots. Civilizations meet each other in surprisingly ordinary conversation sometimes. At night, the desert becomes cold enough to ache inside your bones. Travellers gather around low fires beneath enormous stars while wind moves softly through nearby dunes. One pilgrim speaks about a famous monk named Faxian who journeyed all the way to India searching for authentic Buddhist scriptures. The journey took years. Many travellers died crossing mountains and deserts. Still, people continue making such pilgrimages. Faith can push human beings astonishingly far from home. Back east, political fragmentation continues across China. Dynasties rise briefly before collapsing, armies march, courts intrigue against themselves, yet Buddhism steadily roots itself deeper into Chinese society through all the instability. Perhaps because uncertainty creates fertile ground for spiritual searching. You visit a rural temple one evening during harvest season. Farmers arrive carrying small offerings of rice and incense after long days in the fields. Their clothing smells of soil and smoke. Their hands remain rough from labour. A monk recites prayers for good fortune while children chase each other through the courtyard trying unsuccessfully to remain quiet. One exhausted farmer falls asleep briefly during chanting. Nobody seems offended. Compassion often looks less dramatic than people imagine. As night deepens, oil lamps glow warmly against temple walls while insects sing beyond the gardens. You sit listening to distant wooden chimes moving gently in the wind, and slowly you begin the understanding something important about this divided era. China survives not only through armies or dynasties, it survives through quieter forms of continuity too, through copied texts, shared rituals, stories carried across generations, moments of stillness preserved amid chaos. Far below the mountain temple, political powers continue shifting restlessly beneath clouds of ambition and fear, but here in the drifting fog, beside candle smoke and whispered prayers, human beings search for peace with remarkable persistence. Chang'an glows long before sunset. You first see the city from a dusty western road where caravans descend slowly toward the imperial capital, beneath clouds stained gold by evening light. The outer walls rise enormously from the plain, stretching farther than many travellers expect possible. Guard towers catch the fading sun. Banners ripple above crowded gates where officials inspect arriving merchants, monks, diplomats, and wandering scholars. The Tang Dynasty has arrived, and for a time China feels astonishingly confident. The roads leading into Chang'an carry the world itself. Persian traders guiding camels loaded with glassware and spices, Korean envoys wrapped in fine robes, Central Asian musicians carrying strange instruments shaped from polished wood and stretched skin, Buddhist monks from India, Arab merchants, steppe horsemen. Languages overlap in the market air like layered music. Inside the city walls, life unfolds at overwhelming scale. Broad avenues divide carefully planned districts crowded with homes, temples, taverns, workshops, gardens, military compounds, and administrative offices. Water channels reflect lantern light beneath stone bridges worn smooth by endless footsteps. The smells arrive all at once. Sesame oil sizzling in iron pans, fresh bread from western ovens, horse manure warming in the afternoon heat, incense drifting from temple courtyards. Chang'an feels alive in every direction. You move through the western market beside crowds thick enough to slow walking into a gradual human tide. Silk merchants display brilliant fabrics beneath colourful awnings. Jewellers lean over trays of carved jade and imported silverwork. Storytellers gather listeners beneath shaded corners where children sit cross-legged beside tired labourers. A foreign musician begins playing a lively melody on a pear-shaped lute. Several nearby dancers laugh while trying to follow the rhythm. One elderly scholar pretends disapproval but taps his fingers anyway. The Tang court encourages cosmopolitan culture with remarkable openness. Foreign fashions become fashionable among elites. Polo arrives from Central Asia. New musical styles spread through aristocratic gatherings. Exotic animals appear in imperial menageries. Confidence makes empires curious. And Tang China feels deeply confident. You enter the palace district at dawn while morning mist still lingers low across the stone courtyards. Officials in layered robes move toward administrative halls carrying bamboo documents and ink brushes. Their sleeves sway rhythmically with practiced dignity. The imperial bureaucracy has become extraordinarily sophisticated now. Examinations increasingly shape official careers. Young men across the empire memorize Confucian classics, hoping scholarly success might lift their families into prestige and influence. Some study for years inside cramped rooms lit by cheap oil lamps. Most fail. A few succeed spectacularly. You visit a small rented chamber where one examination candidate named Lin studies late into the night. The room barely fits his sleeping mat, desk, and storage chest. Candle smoke blackens the ceiling above stacks of handwritten notes. Lin's fingers are stained permanently with ink. Outside, the city celebrates Spring Festival with music and wine. Inside, he recites classical passages aloud until his voice grows hoarse. His mother sold jewellery to support his education. Failure would not simply disappoint him. It would burden the entire family. Meritocracy sounds noble. Living inside it feels exhausting. Still, the examination system slowly reshapes Chinese society. Scholarship becomes one path toward advancement beyond inherited aristocratic birth. Not a perfectly fair system. Wealthy families still enjoy enormous advantages, yet the idea matters deeply. Learning itself gains political power. At court, meanwhile, elegance and danger continue dancing together. You attend an evening banquet hosted beneath silk lanterns glowing amber against lacquered beams. Musicians perform while servants carry platters of duck, river fish, steamed buns, and sweet wine. The emperor appears relaxed tonight. Poets recite verses comparing moonlight to silver frost across distant mountains. Courtiers applaud delicately. One official drinks too heavily, and nearly falls backward while bowing, several people suddenly become fascinated by their cups. Tang aristocratic life often feels dazzling from the outside. Silk robes embroidered with gold thread, garden parties beside lotus ponds, hunting expeditions through autumn forests, poetry competitions lasting until dawn. Yet beneath the refinement, political rivalries sharpen constantly. A minister whispers criticism about a rival's military appointments behind carefully raised sleeves. A court lady studies seating arrangements with more attention than the musicians deserve. Eunuchs continue gaining influence within palace affairs. Human ambition adapts beautifully to luxurious environments. You leave the palace and wander through nighttime Chang'an, where lanterns swing gently above crowded entertainment districts. Taverns spill laughter into the streets. Perfume drifts from pleasure houses where musicians entertain wealthy patrons beneath painted ceilings. The city after dark feels softer, more vulnerable somehow. A young courtesan sits near an open window practicing a new song quietly between customers. Her makeup has begun fading around tired eyes. She misses her younger brother back home but rarely speaks about it. In Tang China, talented courtesans often become respected for music, poetry, and conversation as much as beauty. Some influence elite culture profoundly. Others vanish anonymously into difficult lives. History remembers only a handful. Rain begins unexpectedly near midnight. You shelter beneath a tea-house awning beside several strangers watching water race along the stone streets. Steam rises from cups held between cold hands. Someone nearby complains humorously about ruined shoes. A merchant from Samarkand shares dried fruit with a local calligrapher. Neither fully speaks the other's language. Both laugh anyway. Moments like this quietly define cosmopolitan cities more than imperial proclamations ever could. Beyond the capital, Tang China expands militarily across Central Asia and frontier territories. Trade flourishes, population grows. Poetry reaches extraordinary heights through writers like Li Bai and Du Fu, whose words later generations memorize for centuries, but prosperity creates its own illusions. You travel briefly into rural provinces where tax burdens remain heavy despite imperial wealth. Farmers labour endlessly beneath summer heat while aristocrats in distant capitals celebrate refined aesthetics. One old farmer wipes sweat from his face using sleeves patched so many times the original fabric barely remains visible. He's heard stories about Chang'an's magnificence. He smiles faintly when describing them, then returns to repairing an irrigation channel before sunset. Empires always contain multiple realities simultaneously. Still, during these decades, Tang China genuinely becomes one of the world's great centers of culture and power. Foreign visitors describe Chang'an with astonishment. Trade routes pulse with movement. Art flourishes beside political strength. For now, at least, you stand atop the city wall late one evening watching lanterns flicker endlessly across the capital below. Music drifts upward through warm summer air. Somewhere distant, temple bells ring softly through the darkness. The city feels immortal tonight, radiant, confident, certain of itself. And perhaps that certainty contains the first faint shadow of future collapse. Though nobody standing beneath these glowing lanterns can fully see it yet. The curtains move before anyone notices her. Not dramatically, just a slight motion behind silk screens while ministers continue debating tax reforms beneath the painted beams of the Tang court. But inside imperial palaces, tiny movements can alter history. You stand within the great audience hall of Chang'an during the reign of Emperor Gaozong. Morning light filters through incense smoke in pale shafts across polished floors. Officials kneel in ordered rows wearing layered robes heavy enough to feel suffocating during summer heat. The emperor coughs softly into his sleeve. His health has weakened over recent years. Headaches trouble him constantly. Court physicians prescribe herbal treatments, rest, prayers, dietary adjustments. None fully restore his strength. And behind the silk curtains near the throne sits a woman listening carefully. Wu Zetian. At first glance, her rise appears almost impossible. She entered the palace years earlier as a low-ranking concubine during the reign of Gaozong's father. After the old emperor died, tradition required childless concubines to retire into Buddhist convents. Most disappeared quietly from political relevance forever. Wu did not. Accounts differ about exactly how she returned to court. Historians still debate certain details beneath layers of later propaganda and scandal. But somehow she re-entered palace life and gradually captured Gaozong's attention with extraordinary intelligence and emotional precision. Now she watches everything. You glimpse her briefly later that afternoon walking through a garden corridor lined with blooming peonies. Her expression remains composed almost beyond reading. Attendants move several steps behind, carrying silk fans and documents. She notices details other people miss. Who hesitates before answering questions? Which ministers avoid eye contact? Which princes appear overly confident? Inside the palace, rumours follow her constantly. Some admire her brilliance, others fear her ambition. Many do both simultaneously. You spend several days observing court life around her growing influence. It becomes obvious quickly that Wu understands power as something far more intimate than military force alone. Power lives in access, timing, information, emotional leverage. The emperor increasingly relies on her advice during administrative matters. Ministers who dismiss her too openly soon discover promotions disappearing mysteriously. Rivals find themselves accused of corruption or disloyalty. Sometimes the accusations prove true, sometimes perhaps not. Imperial politics rarely rewards innocence. One senior official named Jiang leaves the palace visibly shaken after a private audience concerning military appointments. Sweat darkens the collar of his formal robes despite the cool weather. He pauses alone beside a courtyard pond afterward, staring silently into the water. By evening, servants already whisper that his political position may collapse. Inside the women's quarters, tension thickens almost daily. Other consorts understand exactly what is happening. The emperor's affection increasingly centers around Wu, but affection alone does not explain her rise. She participates directly in governance. She reads memorials. She discusses policy that unsettles many people far more than romance ever could. One older court lady sits quietly while younger attendants gossip nearby about Wu's latest influence over imperial decisions. The older woman says nothing for several minutes, then finally murmurs, almost to herself, that men become especially frightened when women prove politically competent. Nobody responds. Outside the palace walls, ordinary citizens know little about the precise intrigues unfolding within the inner court. Chang'an continues thriving. Markets overflow with goods. Poetry gatherings fill taverns late into the night. Buddhist temples echo with prayers and bells. Yet even common rumours begin drifting outward eventually. The emperor grows weaker, Lady Wu grows stronger. You walk through the capital during autumn rain while merchants shelter goods beneath canvas coverings and sedan chairs splash through muddy streets. A noodle vendor laughs with customers about court gossip none of them fully understand. Still, everyone senses something shifting. Back inside the palace, Wu's political instincts sharpen further during crisis. When rebellions threaten frontier regions or court factions challenge imperial authority, she responds decisively. Officials loyal to her gain advancement. Enemies vanish from influence, or from life. Some later historians accuse her of terrible brutality. Executions, torture, manufactured conspiracies. Certain accusations likely contain truth. Others may reflect later Confucian hostility toward powerful women ruling directly. Historical memory often becomes political warfare long after death. Still, Wu herself clearly understands the danger surrounding her position. She survives within a court culture deeply suspicious of female authority. Every decision faces extra scrutiny. Every rumour carries sharper consequences. So she moves carefully, until eventually she no longer needs to. You witness one remarkable court session after Gaozong's illness worsened significantly. Ministers gather expecting routine administrative discussion. Instead, Wu speaks from behind the curtain with calm authority, answering policy questions herself while the emperor listens silently beside her. The room changes instantly. Some officials lower their heads respectfully, others freeze almost imperceptibly, because everyone present understands what the moment means. Power has already shifted. The phrase later historians use for this arrangement sounds elegant enough, ruling from behind the curtain. Reality probably felt far more tense. A young palace scribe recording the proceedings keeps accidentally blotting ink across his documents because his hands tremble slightly. He realizes he may be witnessing history. He also realizes history can become dangerous for witnesses. Years pass. Gaozong eventually dies, and Wu navigates the chaotic succession struggles afterward with astonishing effectiveness. Sons become emperors briefly. Rival factions maneuver desperately. Yet she consistently emerges stronger. Finally, she takes the throne herself. Not as empress consort, not as regent, as emperor. The only woman in Chinese history ever to rule officially in her own name over the imperial state. The atmosphere inside the court during her formal accession feels almost unreal. Drums echo through ceremonial halls. Incense smoke coils upward beneath golden banners. Officials kneel in ordered silence while Wu ascends the throne, wearing robes heavy with embroidered dragons. Some support her sincerely, some obey reluctantly. Some probably feel both at once. Outside the palace, reactions vary widely. Many Confucian scholars recoil from the violation of traditional gender expectations. Others quietly acknowledge her effectiveness. Common people mostly continue worrying about taxes, harvests, and local security as they always have. Dynastic legitimacy matters less when your rice crop fails. Yet Wu's reign proves remarkably capable in many respects. She expands examination systems, promotes talented officials regardless of aristocratic birth, supports Buddhism, and strengthens imperial administration. She also maintains extensive secret police networks and deals harshly with opposition. Human beings rarely fit neatly into heroic or villainous categories, especially rulers. One winter evening near the end of her reign, you see Wu standing alone briefly on a palace terrace overlooking Chang'an beneath falling snow. Lanterns glow faintly across the distant capital. Wind lifts the edge of her cloak. For just a moment she appears tired rather than legendary. An aging woman who spent decades fighting for authority inside a world determined to deny it. Then attendants arrive again, ceremony resumes, history continues moving, and below the palace roofs, the great Tang capital still shines brilliantly through the snow, while the only female emperor in Chinese history watches over it from behind layers of silk. Suspicion and hard-earned power. Moonlight settles softly across the river like spilled milk. You drift downstream aboard a narrow wooden boat while reeds whisper against the dark water, and distant lanterns glow along the shoreline. Somewhere ahead, laughter rises from an inn hidden among willow trees. A flute begins playing. Slow notes, melancholy notes, the kind that seem designed for sleepless nights. The Tang Dynasty still stands at the height of its cultural brilliance, though small fractures already spread quietly beneath the surface. Court politics remain dangerous. Frontier generals grow increasingly powerful. Taxes burden exhausted farmers far from the capital. Yet poetry flourishes everywhere. Perhaps beauty becomes most precious when people sense impermanence approaching. You arrive at the riverside inn shortly before midnight. Travellers crowd beneath timber beams stained dark by years of smoke and spilled wine. Wet cloaks hang beside the doorway. The room smells warmly alive. Rice wine, roasted fish, rain-soaked wool drying near the hearth. At a low table near the window sits a scholar with untidy hair and bright restless eyes already softened by drink. Li Bai, or Li Po, depending on pronunciation and translation, one of China's greatest poets. Though tonight he mostly appears as a charming man slightly too drunk to trust near open water, friends surround him laughing while servants refill ceramic cups faster than wisdom recommends. Li Bai gestures dramatically toward the moon outside the window while reciting fresh verses improvised between drinks. Everyone listens, not because he behaves grandly, because he makes ordinary moments feel briefly eternal. That may be the closest thing to magic human beings ever achieve. The Tang literary world pulses through taverns, gardens, riverboats, temples, and dusty roadside stations. Scholars travel constantly between appointments, examinations, exile postings, and political opportunities. Along the roads they write poems about loneliness, friendship, mountains, war, homesickness, sometimes all four at once. You travel northward beside a government courier road lined with old trees bent by decades of wind. Horses snort clouds into the cold morning air. At relay stations, exhausted officials warm numb hands around bowls of thin soup before continuing onward with sealed documents. One young clerk pauses long enough to scribble a short poem about frost gathering on an abandoned armour near the frontier. Even bureaucracy produces poets in Tang China. Farther west, another poet walks through harder circumstances. Dufu, where Li Bai often drifts through the world with romantic spontaneity. Dufu notices suffering more steadily. War, famine, displacement, exhausted soldiers, hungry civilians. His poetry carries emotional weight like damp cloth after rain. You find him in a modest lodging house during troubled years when rebellion and instability begin damaging the empire. Wind whistles through gaps in the wooden walls. His children sleep nearby beneath patched blankets. The rice stores are low again. Dufu sits beside a flickering lamp trying to finish a poem while coughing intermittently into his sleeve. Ink freezes slightly at the brush tip from winter cold. Outside, dogs bark somewhere in darkness beyond the village. Inside, he writes about ruined homes and wandering refugees with painful clarity. History often remembers golden ages through their luxuries. Poets remember them through human cost. The examination system continues shaping intellectual life everywhere. Young scholars memorize classical texts, obsessively hoping success might grant official positions and family honor. You enter one provincial academy during early spring. Cherry blossoms drift through the courtyard while students bend over bamboo desks, copying passages by hand. The atmosphere feels tense despite the beauty. One candidate has studied for 7 years already without passing. Another hides anxiety behind arrogant jokes. A third secretly writes love poems instead of legal commentaries. Probably healthier, honestly. Their teacher walks slowly between rows, correcting calligraphy strokes with weary patience. He smells faintly of ink, tea leaves, and old paper. Outside the academy walls, ordinary labourers repair flood damage along the nearby riverbanks. Mud coats their legs to the knee. They work silently beneath grey skies while scholars debate moral philosophy several streets away. China contains many worlds at once. Still, poetry crosses social boundaries more than many other arts. Tavern musicians sing famous verses. Boatmen memorize lines heard from travellers. Soldiers carry favourite poems folded inside baggage packs stained with rain and smoke. Words travel surprisingly far. One humid evening you share wine with a frontier officer stationed near the northwest borders. Sand blows constantly against the fortress walls. The men sleep lightly because raids can arrive without warning. The officer recites a poem from memory while staring into the fire. His voice grows quieter near the final lines. He misses home terribly. The Tang military frontier system stretches soldiers across enormous distances. Some never return eastward. Their poems survive because longing survives translation remarkably well. Homesickness sounds similar across centuries. Back in Chang'an, literary gatherings continue beneath silk lanterns and flowering gardens. Wealthy patrons host elaborate evenings where scholars compose verses spontaneously while musicians accompany them on lutes and flutes. You attend one such gathering beside a lotus pond shimmering beneath moonlight. Wine cups float across the water during poetic drinking games. Guests laugh softly while composing lines before the cups reach them. One aristocratic woman writes verses so sharp and elegant several men pretend not to feel intimidated, pretend unsuccessfully. The Tang era allows unusual cultural visibility for talented women in certain elite circles. Some become respected poets, musicians, painters, or courtesans admired for artistic brilliance. Still, opportunities remain fragile. A gifted courtesan named Yu sits later beside an open window brushing loose powder from her sleeves after guests depart. The room smells faintly of plum perfume and extinguished candles. She earns admiration nightly, respect less consistently. Her poems survive only in fragments. History loses far more voices than it keeps. As decades pass, signs of instability grow harder to ignore. Military governors gain dangerous autonomy. Court factions sharpen, economic inequality deepens, natural disasters strain already burdened communities. Yet poetry somehow becomes even more emotionally powerful during uncertainty. Perhaps because art helps people notice what politics destroys. You travel one final evening beside the Yangtze where river mist drifts through moonlight and distant temple bells echo faintly across the water. A lone traveller sits near the shore, reading poetry aloud to himself, while waiting for dawn ferries. His clothes are worn thin, his voice remains beautiful. The poems speak about passing friendships, distant mountains, fleeting beauty, and the sadness of watching civilizations change. You realize then that Tang poetry endures not because it praises empire, it endures because it notices humanity carefully. A cup of wine beside cold rain, a tired official missing home, an aging poet hearing war drums beyond spring blossoms, small moments, quiet emotions. The kinds of things history usually forgets unless someone writes them down beneath the moonlight before they disappear. The palace smells of pear blossoms and candle smoke. Spring has arrived in Chang'an, softening the imperial gardens with drifting petals and damp evening air. Servants move quietly through covered corridors carrying lacquered trays of tea and folded silk garments, while musicians rehearse somewhere beyond the inner courtyards. Everything appears graceful tonight. Carefully graceful. Inside the women's quarters of the Tang court, elegance becomes a survival skill nearly as important as beauty itself. You walk beneath painted beams toward the residence of a favoured concubine whose windows glow warmly against the gathering dusk. Lantern light spills across polished stone paths still wet from afternoon rain. Somewhere nearby, someone laughs too loudly, then abruptly stops. Even joy requires caution here. The Emperor's affection shapes entire lives within these walls. A single invitation to dine privately can elevate a woman's status overnight. Weeks without attention can feel like slow erasure, and because affection carries political consequences, every gesture becomes charged with meaning. A young concubine named Lian sits before a bronze mirror while attendants arrange jewelled pins through her dark hair. Her robe smells faintly of jasmine oil. She keeps asking whether the sleeve embroidery appears too formal for tonight's gathering. What she really means is something else. Will the Emperor notice me? One attendant answers carefully. Another avoids answering entirely. Both understand how dangerous honesty can become in palace life. Beyond the cosmetics and rituals, most of these women arrive here very young. Families select daughters for beauty, refinement, or political advantage. Some enter willingly, others simply obey expectations shaped long before birth. Once inside the palace, their world narrows dramatically. Walls, schedules, rivalries, waiting, so much waiting. You pass through a long gallery where silk curtains stir gently in the evening breeze. Several concubines sit together embroidering cranes onto pale fabric while discussing poetry and music with practiced calm. Yet beneath the conversation flows constant calculation. Who received gifts recently? Who accompanied the emperor during morning ceremonies? Which families gain influence at court? One woman smiles sweetly while complimenting another's necklace. Moments later, after she leaves, the smile vanishes completely. Human beings do not become less competitive inside beautiful surroundings. Often the opposite. Tonight, the emperor hosts a private banquet beneath flowering pear trees inside the inner garden. Lanterns hang from low branches like floating moons, while musicians tune stringed instruments beside the reflecting pool. The atmosphere feels almost dreamlike. Warm wine, night insects humming softly, perfume drifting through cool spring air. The emperor arrives surrounded by eunuchs and attendants whose movements appear rehearsed down to the smallest gesture. The women bow low together, sleeves spreading gracefully across the stone. For several hours, everything seems harmonious. Poetry is recited, music plays softly, wine cups are refilled before emptying. A favoured concubine performs a dance beneath the lantern light with movements delicate enough to silence the entire garden. Even the servants pause briefly to watch. Beauty inside imperial courts often carries sadness hidden beneath admiration. These performances are not simply artistic expression. They are offerings, proofs of worthiness, attempts to remain visible inside systems designed around competition for attention. After the performance ends, applause rises gently through the garden. The dancer smiles perfectly. Later, alone beside the dressing mirror, she rubs aching muscles from her legs in exhausted silence. You wander deeper into the palace after midnight once the banquet disperses. The corridors grow quieter now. Guards patrol beneath moonlight while distant fountains echo softly through empty courtyards. Behind closed doors, however, sleep comes unevenly. One concubine cries quietly after learning the emperor cancelled tomorrow's visit. Another reads poetry alone by candlelight. A third studies political gossip delivered secretly through loyal servants. Inside imperial households, emotional survival becomes strangely strategic. Children complicate everything further. A son born to a favoured woman might someday become emperor. A daughter might secure valuable alliances through marriage. Suddenly, affection transforms into dynastic importance. You visit the nursery chambers where nurses rock half-sleeping infants beneath embroidered blankets. The rooms smell warmly of milk, medicinal herbs, and sandalwood. One young mother watches her sleeping son with fierce tenderness, an unmistakable fear, because palace children do not grow up normally. Every tutor, servant, and visitor understands their political significance. Rival factions already study them carefully. History often enters human life through cradles long before battlefields. Outside the palace, ordinary families continue living far simpler emotional realities. You leave the imperial compound briefly and walk through nighttime Chang'an, where common households gather around evening meals beneath modest rooflines. A noodle seller closes his stall while his wife counts the day's earnings beside a lantern. A grandmother tells stories to children already falling asleep against her shoulder. Somewhere nearby, neighbours argue over borrowed tools and laugh again moments later. Messy ordinary life. Without golden walls, without ceremonial danger, there is something almost enviable about it. Back inside the palace, one older concubine named Madame Shu walks slowly through the garden before dawn. Her years of influence have faded gradually as younger women gained attention. Servants still bow respectfully, but the atmosphere around her feels quieter now. She pauses beside a pear tree, shedding pale blossoms onto the stones. Once, the emperor visited her chambers constantly. Now entire weeks pass without summons. No scandal ended her importance, only time. That may hurt more. She touches one fallen blossom gently before continuing onward through the empty garden. The Tang court loves beauty deeply, but beauty here remains inseparable from impermanence. Youth fades, favour shifts, emperors age, dynasties weaken slowly beneath their own splendour, and already, though few fully realise it, the empire itself drifts toward enormous catastrophe. Far beyond Chang'an's glowing lanterns, military governors accumulate dangerous autonomy. Frontier armies grow restless. Economic pressures spread quietly through exhausted provinces. Yet tonight the palace still glimmers beautifully beneath the spring moon. Concubines arrange silk sleeves before bronze mirrors. Eunuchs whisper through hidden corridors. Musicians practice melodies that dissolve into darkness after the final note. And somewhere inside the great imperial residence, a woman lies awake listening for footsteps that may or may not stop outside her door before dawn. The drums begin before sunrise. At first they sound distant, almost swallowed by fog drifting across the northern frontier. Soldiers waking inside cold barracks pause briefly while fastening armor straps. Horses lift their heads from feeding troughs. Messengers hurry between command tents, carrying sealed orders already damp with morning mist. Something has gone wrong. Very wrong. The Tang Empire still appears magnificent from Chang'an. Lantern festivals continue. Poetry gatherings continue. Court ceremonies unfold beneath painted roofs and polished gold. But along the empire's outer edges, dangerous tensions have been building quietly for years. Military governors command enormous regional armies far from direct imperial control. Among them stands one especially powerful figure, and Lushan, part frontier general, part court favourite, entirely ambitious. Accounts describe him as charismatic, clever, theatrical, and physically enormous. He jokes easily at court, entertains the emperor, flatters influential concubines, and commands fierce loyalty among troops stationed along the northeastern frontier. Too much loyalty, as it turns out. You stand inside a military camp during the winter of 755 while snow drifts against dark banners snapping sharply in the wind. Soldiers sharpen blades beside smoky fires. Officers study maps illuminated by trembling lantern light. Rumours spread quickly now, and Lushan is marching south. Entire garrisons have joined him. Cities are surrendering without resistance. One young soldier mutters that rebellions always begin somewhere else, until suddenly they arrive at your own doorstep. Fair observation. Within weeks, chaos spreads astonishingly fast. The Tang court reacts slowly at first, trapped by disbelief and political confusion. Officials argue over strategy while reports grow steadily worse. Frontier defences collapse. Rebel armies push toward the heart of the empire with terrifying speed. You ride along crowded roads choked with refugees fleeing ahead of the advancing armies. Ox carts groan beneath overloaded possessions. Children wrapped in blankets cry from exhaustion. Snow mixes with mud beneath endless footsteps. Nobody knows which towns remain safe anymore. An elderly woman carries a cage containing 2 chickens pressed against her chest, as though they represent the last stable thing left in the world. Perhaps they do. Inside Chang'an, panic spreads unevenly. At first the markets remain open. Tea houses continue serving customers. Court officials insist the situation remains manageable. Then more refugees arrive. Then wounded soldiers. Then smoke appears faintly along the northern horizon. The illusion breaks quickly after that. You walk through the capital during the final days before evacuation. The atmosphere feels surreal. Some aristocrats still attend banquets while others secretly pack valuables into travel trunks. Servants run breathlessly through corridors carrying conflicting orders. Horses scream in crowded stable yards. One palace musician sits quietly tuning her instrument, although her hands shake visibly. Routine becomes a fragile defense against terror. Finally, the emperor decides to flee. The imperial procession leaving Chang'an stretches for miles along muddy roads beneath cold grey skies. Court officials, soldiers, servants, concubines, supply wagons, horses, and frightened attendants move together in exhausted confusion. Rain begins halfway through the march. Cold rain, the kind that soaks through silk and wool alike without mercy. You ride beside weary palace servants struggling to keep carts from overturning in deep mud. One young attendant loses a shoe entirely and continues barefoot because stopping means falling behind. History later remembers imperial flights dramatically. Living through them mostly feels miserable. The emperor himself appears stunned by unfolding disaster. For decades, the Tang court believed itself the centre of civilization. Now, the Son of Heaven flees his own capital while rebel forces advance behind him. Confidence collapses loudly inside human beings, and somewhere along the road comes one of the most haunting moments in Tang history. Imperial guards blame Yang Guifei, the emperor's beloved consort, and her powerful relatives for the catastrophe surrounding the court. Resentment toward her family has simmered for years. Now exhausted soldiers demand punishment. The atmosphere at the Mawei courier station turns tense enough to taste. Wet leather, fierce sweat, rainwater dripping steadily from roof edges. The guards refuse to continue protecting the emperor unless Yang Guifei dies. Accounts differ in certain details, but the ending remains grim. The emperor weeps, the concubine is executed. Some later stories romanticize the moment endlessly. Poems mourn her beauty beneath drifting pear blossoms. Plays transform the tragedy into timeless love. Reality was colder. A frightened court trapped during military collapse sacrificed one woman to calm angry soldiers. You stand afterward beside the muddy road watching rain fall through silent trees, while the imperial procession slowly resumes movement. Nobody speaks loudly anymore. Even grief feels exhausted. Meanwhile, Chang'an falls to rebel forces. You enter the occupied capital weeks later beneath smoke-darkened skies. Entire districts stand abandoned. Shops lie shattered open. Stray dogs wander through streets once crowded with musicians and silk merchants. The great cosmopolitan capital of the Tang world suddenly feels hollow. Inside, abandoned aristocratic residences. Papers blow across empty floors. Half-finished meals rot beside overturned furniture. A child's toy lies forgotten near a doorway blackened by fire. War destroys grandeur surprisingly fast. The rebellion spreads across enormous regions and continues for years with catastrophic consequences. Famine follows military devastation. Disease spreads through refugee populations. Entire agricultural systems collapse. Modern historians estimate the death toll reached staggering levels. Though exact numbers remain uncertain, census records afterwards show enormous population decline. Millions vanish from history, most without names. You travel through provinces scarred by the conflict. Burned villages, untended fields, irrigation canals clogged with debris and corpses. Survivors search abandoned homes for anything useful left behind. One farmer kneels silently in the ruins of his house, turning a cracked bowl over in his hands again and again, perhaps because it belonged to someone dead, perhaps because shock leaves people moving strangely. Tang forces eventually regain control of the empire with outside assistance and brutal military effort, and Lushan himself dies before the rebellion ends fully. Yet victory feels hollow. The old Tang confidence never truly returns. Court authority weakens permanently. Regional military leaders gain greater independence. Economic strain deepens. Trust fractures across the empire. And emotionally, something breaks inside the civilization itself. You return to Chang'an years later during a quiet evening. Lanterns glow again along repaired streets. Markets reopen. Music drifts from distant tea houses. But the city feels older now, more cautious. A poet sits beside the canal writing verses about ruined gardens overtaken by weeds after war. Nearby, survivors walk home carrying vegetables and firewood beneath fading twilight. Life continues. People always continue. Yet beneath the rebuilt beauty lingers memory. Smoke over palace roofs, bodies beside frozen roads, the sound of drums approaching through morning fog. And somewhere in the recovering capital, older courtiers still lower their voices whenever the name Anlushan enters conversation, as though catastrophe itself might return if spoken too loudly after dark. Paper rustles softly in the morning breeze. You sit beside an open window overlooking a busy Qing Dynasty street, while sunlight spreads across tiled rooftops and narrow canal bridges below. Vendors are already shouting prices for steamed buns and fresh fish. Boatmen guide cargo barges through crowded waterways with practiced impatience. The world feels different now. The Tang dynasty eventually collapsed beneath rebellion, fragmentation, and exhausted authority. New kingdoms rose and vanished during decades of political division before China reunified again under the Song. But the Song world does not resemble the old Tang Empire entirely. Less militaristic, perhaps, more commercially alive, more quietly inventive. You notice it immediately in the cities. Kaifeng, the northern Song capital, hums constantly with movement. Shops spill goods directly onto crowded streets. Tea houses remain open deep into the night. Printed advertisements hang beside doorways. Restaurants specialize in regional cuisines. Art dealers display paintings beneath silk awnings while fortune tellers compete for customers nearby. Urban life has become astonishingly sophisticated. And paper is everywhere. Paper money, printed books, receipts, letters, examination manuals copied in enormous quantities. You pass a printing workshop where workers carve characters into wooden blocks with incredible patience. Ink stains their fingertips permanently black. Sheets dry on hanging lines beside open courtyards filled with the smell of pine soot and wet paper pulp. One printer jokes that scholars create enough demand to drown the empire in essays. Not entirely inaccurate. The civil examination system now dominates elite ambition more than ever before. Families invest fortunes educating sons for examinations that might grant government positions and social prestige. You visit one student lodging house near the examination compound during winter. The rooms are tiny, the anxiety enormous. Young men wrap themselves in blankets while memorizing classical texts by candlelight late into the night. Some mutter passages aloud while pacing. Others stare blankly at notes through exhausted eyes. One candidate has copied the same essay model so many times his wrist trembles uncontrollably. Outside, snow falls quietly across the city roofs. Inside, futures depend on handwriting and memory. The Song government relies heavily on scholar officials rather than military aristocrats. Bureaucracy expands enormously. Records become meticulous. Tax systems grow increasingly complex. Administration itself turns into a refined intellectual craft. At least in theory. Reality still includes corruption, factional struggles, and endless political rivalries. You attend a gathering of officials debating reforms inside a warm tea house overlooking the canal district. Steam curls upward from porcelain cups while rain taps softly against paper windows. One minister argues passionately for stronger state granaries to protect poor farmers during famine years. Another insists excessive government intervention weakens local initiative. The discussion grows heated, then polite again, then heated once more. Politics changes clothing across centuries without changing human temperament very much. Outside the tea house, ordinary people navigate this increasingly commercial world with impressive adaptability. You walk through market districts overflowing with goods unimaginable in earlier eras. Ceramic bowls painted with delicate blue glazes, tea bricks from distant mountains, printed novels, medicinal powders, iron cooking tools. A merchant woman balances accounts faster than her assistant can calculate them aloud. Nearby, a restaurant owner complains dramatically about rising noodle prices while customers continue eating anyway. The Song economy thrives through trade, manufacturing, and agricultural expansion. New rice varieties from Southeast Asia increase food production dramatically, especially in the south. Quiet agricultural changes reshape history more deeply than many emperors ever do. You travel southward toward Hangzhou after northern territories gradually fall under pressure from invading steppe powers. The Song court relocates south, transforming Hangzhou into one of the world's most dazzling cities. Marco Polo later describes it with astonishment. Walking there at dusk, you understand why. Canals shimmer beneath lantern reflections. Tea houses overflow with conversation and music. Bridges arch elegantly across crowded waterways where boats glide through drifting mist. The city smells alive. Fried scallion pancakes, river water, incense from hillside temples, fresh rain on stone. Yet even amid prosperity, the Song world carries underlying fragility. Military weakness troubles many officials deeply. Northern frontier threats remain constant. Court debates about defense funding grow increasingly bitter. One retired general drinks heavily beside the docks while complaining that scholars understand poetry better than warfare. Possibly true, not entirely fair, but understandable. The Song elite prize refinement intensely. Painting, calligraphy, philosophy, ceramics, garden design. Beauty becomes woven into daily life with remarkable subtlety. You visit the studio of a landscape painter living beside mist-covered hills outside Hangzhou. He grinds ink slowly while studying distant mountains disappearing into cloud banks. The room feels peaceful, brushes drying near the window, tea cooling beside unfinished scrolls, wind-moving bamboo outside. He explains that true painting captures atmosphere rather than exact appearance. You think about that later while walking home through evening fog. Perhaps entire civilizations work similarly. The Song period also transforms ordinary domestic life in quieter ways. Printed books spread literacy wider than before. Urban entertainment expands, tea culture deepens into social ritual. Furniture changes shape as chairs become increasingly common instead of floor seating. History sometimes moves through kitchens and living rooms more than battlefields. One evening you sit inside a modest family home while 3 generations share dinner beneath warm lamplight. Grandparents discuss weather patterns affecting rice harvests. A teenage daughter practices calligraphy beside the table between bites of food. Her younger brother secretly reads adventure stories hidden inside his school texts. Human beings consistently find ways around educational discipline. Outside, rain begins falling steadily across the tiled roofs. The family closes shutters against the damp night air while distant bells echo from a nearby temple. For a moment the empire feels very far away, and yet the empire always returns eventually. News arrives constantly now about northern invasions. The Qing Dynasty captures vast territories including the old northern capital. Refugees continue flowing southward, carrying memories of lost homes and abandoned ancestral graves. One elderly refugee woman keeps a small pouch of soil from her northern village tucked carefully inside her sleeves. She says it helps her sleep. The Song court survives in the south for generations afterward. Economically vibrant and culturally brilliant despite military vulnerability. Gunpowder weapons begin appearing more frequently. Maritime trade expands dramatically. Chinese ships sail across vast ocean networks connecting Asia commercially. The world grows larger again. Still, beneath the beauty and innovation lingers quiet unease, because everyone understands the northern frontiers remain dangerous, and beyond those frontiers, new powers are already gathering. Tonight, though, Hangzhou glows beautifully beneath reflected lantern light. Scholars compose poems beside canal bridges. Merchants count silver coins behind shop curtains. Families share tea while rain whispers softly against paper windows, and all across Song China, human beings continue building lives from paper, memory, commerce, beauty, and hope beneath skies that never remain calm forever. The horses appear first as shadows along the horizon. You stand beneath a pale northern sky while dry grass bends endlessly in the wind across the steppe. The air smells sharp here. Dust, leather, smoke from distant campfires. Somewhere far away, a hawk circles above open land without boundaries. Then the riders emerge fully, fast, disciplined, silent except for hoofbeats. The Mongols, for generations, Chinese dynasties feared northern invasions from nomadic confederations and frontier kingdoms, but the Mongol expansion reshapes the entire Eurasian world with terrifying speed. Cities burn from Korea to Eastern Europe, trade routes transform, empires vanish, and eventually China faces the storm directly. You ride beside terrified refugees moving southward after reports spread about Mongol victories across northern territories. Entire towns empty before enemy armies even arrive. Rumours grow larger with every retelling. The Mongols never spare anyone. The Mongols drink blood. The Mongols cannot be defeated. Fear travels faster than cavalry. One farmer loads grain sacks onto a cart while his wife gathers sleeping children from their bedding before dawn. They leave behind half the harvest because there is no room. The ox keeps stopping nervously. The children keep asking when they can come home. Nobody answers. The Mongol military machine feels frighteningly efficient. Riders move across impossible distances with astonishing speed and coordination. They communicate through relay systems stretching across conquered territory. They adapt quickly to siege warfare despite their steppe origins. And they learn from every enemy. You arrive near the aftermath of a northern siege where smoke still rises from shattered walls beneath cold rain. Burned timbers crack softly in the ruins. Dogs wander through abandoned streets searching for scraps. A Song refugee kneels beside a collapsed doorway, turning broken roof tiles aside one by one with numb hands. Her parents disappeared during the assault. She still believes they might be trapped underneath somewhere. War creates strange forms of hope. Meanwhile, within the Mongol camps themselves, life follows rhythms unfamiliar to settled Chinese society. You walk through rows of felt tents spread across rolling grasslands beneath enormous skies. Children chase one another between horses tethered beside cooking fires. Women manage supplies with sharp efficiency. Warriors repair saddles while fermented mare's milk passes between rough hands. The camps smell alive. Animal hide, wood smoke, sweat dried into wool clothing. The Mongols appear brutal to their enemies because often they are brutal. Entire populations suffer massacres after resistance. Cities refusing surrender sometimes vanish almost completely. Yet within their own world exists complexity too. Loyalty matters deeply. Discipline matters deeply. Adaptability matters deeply. History becomes dangerous whenever human beings flatten entire civilizations into monsters alone. Eventually, leadership of Mongol ambitions in China passes to Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. Unlike some earlier conquerors, Kublai grows increasingly fascinated with Chinese systems of governance and imperial legitimacy. He does not simply want plunder, he wants dynasty. You meet him first inside a sprawling imperial hunting camp where Chinese advisors, Mongol nobles, Buddhist monks, Persian astronomers, and military officers gather beneath enormous silk tents. The atmosphere feels strangely international. Languages overlap constantly. Servants hurry carrying maps and steaming food. Falcons perch beside jeweled saddles. Kublai himself projects calm authority rather than theatrical violence. He listens carefully, observes carefully, eats heavily, laughs occasionally with surprising warmth, but beneath the charm lies relentless ambition. He intends to rule China completely. The Song dynasty fights desperately for survival. Southern officials debate military strategy endlessly while refugees flood safer regions farther south. River defences strengthen. Naval battles intensify along the Yangtze. You board a Song warship during one humid summer evening while sailors prepare for possible Mongol attack. The river smells thick and muddy beneath the heat. Mosquitoes swarm near hanging lanterns. One young sailor quietly admits he has never actually seen a Mongol before. Only heard stories. Fear often feeds best on distance. The Song resistance lasts remarkably long despite overwhelming pressure. Southern China's river networks and naval strength slow Mongol conquest significantly. Some officials remain fiercely loyal even as defeat grows increasingly inevitable. You witness one heartbreaking evacuation from a coastal town as Song loyalists retreat farther southward. Families crowd onto boats carrying ancestral tablets wrapped carefully in cloth beside sacks of rice and sleeping infants. Rain lashes sideways across the harbour. A scholar stands near the dock reciting poetry through tears while watching soldiers burn supplies before abandonment. Civilizations mourn themselves sometimes. In 1279, the final major Song resistance collapses after the Battle of Yamen. Accounts describe officials and loyalists choosing death over surrender, including one minister carrying the child emperor into the sea. Historical memory later transforms the moment into tragic legend. Reality probably felt colder. Salt water, Panic, exhaustion beyond heroism, China now belongs to the Mongol Yuan dynasty. For the first time in centuries, no. The entire empire falls under foreign rule from conquerors originating beyond the traditional Chinese world. The transition unsettles society deeply. Many Chinese officials serve the new regime pragmatically. Others withdraw into private life or quiet resistance. Mongol rulers place foreigners and Central Asians into important administrative positions, creating resentment among sections of the Chinese population. Yet trade flourishes enormously under Mongol stability across Eurasia. Merchants travel farther than before. Marco Polo famously visits the Yuan court. Ideas, technologies, religions and diseases move along reopened routes connecting east and west. The world becomes startlingly interconnected. You walk through the Yuan capital of Kanbalik, later Beijing, where Persian traders bargain beside Chinese craftsmen and Mongol cavalry officers patrol crowded markets. The city feels different from earlier Chinese capitals. Less delicate perhaps, more expansive and more openly multicultural. A Muslim astronomer discusses star charts with a Chinese scholar while nearby a Tibetan monk spins prayer beads beside spice merchants from Central Asia. Empires create strange encounters. Still, beneath the cosmopolitan energy remains tension. Many Chinese subjects resent Mongol privilege and social hierarchy. Natural disasters, flooding, inflation, and corruption gradually weaken Yuan authority over time, and Kublai Khan himself ages heavily. You see him one winter evening seated alone longer than usual after a formal banquet ends. Snow falls quietly beyond palace windows. Musicians have stopped playing. Half-finished dishes cool untouched beside him. He conquered an empire larger than most rulers could imagine, yet grief surrounds him too. Dead relative, political burdens, a body growing tired. Even world conquerors cannot negotiate permanently with mortality. Outside, the streets of Yuan China continue humming beneath cold night air. Boatmen guide cargo through frozen canals. Merchants close market stalls beneath hanging lanterns. Families share evening meals inside warm rooms smelling of garlic and coal smoke. And above them all, beneath vast winter skies stretching from the Mongol steppe to the southern seas, the conquered empire slowly begins changing both its rulers and itself. The walls rise from the earth like silence made visible. You approach Beijing before dawn beneath a winter sky washed pale grey with snow clouds. Frost crunches underfoot. Breath hangs white in the air around labourers already hauling timber carts through the outer streets. Ahead of you stretches the Forbidden City, massive red walls, golden roofs disappearing into morning mist, gates large enough to make human beings feel temporary. The Mongol Yuan dynasty has fallen now. Rebellion, famine, flooding, and growing resentment eventually shattered Mongol rule. Out of the chaos rose the Ming Dynasty, founded by a man born into desperate poverty. Zhu Yuanzhang, later called the Hongwu Emperor. His childhood unfolded through hunger, disease, and loss. His family died during famine years. He spent time as a wandering monk begging for food before joining rebel movements against Mongol authority. People who survive early hardship sometimes rule with unusual suspicion afterward. Hongwu certainly does. You walk through the early Ming court where discipline feels severe enough to tighten the muscles in your neck. Officials kneel carefully during audiences beneath hard-eyed imperial scrutiny. Administrative records multiply endlessly. Punishments remain harsh. The emperor trusts very few people. Reasonably perhaps, dangerously perhaps. He abolishes the position of prime minister after accusing officials of conspiracy. Massive purges follow. Thousands die through investigations driven by paranoia, political calculation, or both. One exhausted court clerk copies execution orders late into the night while candle wax pools across his sleeves. His brush hand cramps repeatedly. Still he continues writing. Empires rely heavily on tired bureaucrats performing unbearable tasks. Yet the Ming world also rebuilds stability after decades of war. Agriculture recovers. Population grows, trade expands. Chinese cultural traditions reassert themselves strongly after Mongol rule, and eventually the imperial capital settles permanently in Beijing beneath the rule of the Yongle Emperor. Hongwu's son, he commissions enormous construction projects, among them the Forbidden City. You enter through the Meridian Gate alongside officials arriving for dawn court ceremonies. Drums echo faintly through freezing air, while rows of eunuchs stand motionless beside towering pillars lacquered red enough to resemble fresh blood in lantern light. Everything inside the palace complex feels carefully arranged to project cosmic order. Courtyards stretch vast and empty between ceremonial halls. Stone pathways align precisely beneath the heavens. Dragon carvings coil across marble staircases worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The architecture itself insists upon hierarchy, and at the centre stands the emperor, theoretically the son of heaven, in practice often a lonely man trapped inside ritual. You spend several weeks observing life within the palace walls. The scale of the imperial household astonishes you first. Thousands of servants, thousands of eunuchs, countless concubines, guards, cooks, scribes, craftsmen, attendants, an entire city hidden inside another city. And yet, despite the crowds, isolation permeates everything. The emperor eats alone frequently. Ministers communicate through rigid ceremony. Concubines compete quietly for attention inside carefully guarded quarters. Even laughter sounds restrained here. You walk through an inner courtyard during heavy summer rain while eunuchs hurry beneath covered corridors carrying sealed documents, protected inside oilcloth cases. Water pours from roof dragons in silver sheets. Thunder rolls above the palace roofs. A young eunuch slips on wet stone and nearly drops an imperial decree into the floodwater. For several horrifying seconds, nobody breathes. Then he catches it. Relief sweeps visibly across nearby faces. Small accidents become terrifying inside authoritarian systems. The eunuchs themselves occupy a strange emotional position within Ming Palace life. Castrated before service. They exist simultaneously as trusted servants and deeply feared political actors. Some remain humble administrators. Others accumulate enormous influence through proximity to the emperor. Information becomes power quickly inside closed worlds. One senior eunuch named Wang moves silently through palace corridors with measured confidence. Officials pretend not to fear him, pretend unsuccessfully. He knows which ministers argue privately against imperial policy, which concubines receive secret letters, which princes resent succession arrangements. Knowledge flows toward those standing nearest closed doors. Outside the Forbidden City, Beijing expands into a bustling imperial capital filled with markets, temples, workshops, scholars, soldiers, and migrants arriving from across the empire. The city smells different depending on the district. Coal smoke drifting through winter alleys, fresh noodles steaming beside market stalls, wet leather near military compounds, incense curling upward from temple courtyards. You wander through a night market where storytellers entertain crowds beneath swinging lanterns while vendors fry sesame cakes and crackling oil. Children weave between adults carrying sugar sweets shaped like animals. Life beyond the palace walls feels wonderfully messy. Inside the palace, by contrast, everything feels controlled almost to suffocation. A concubine named Mei spends her evenings practicing the guqin beside an open window overlooking the imperial gardens. Cicadas sing through humid darkness outside, while candlelight flickers across polished wood. She arrived at court age 14, she's now 27. Entire years disappear quietly inside these walls. She misses ordinary things most. Street food, rain without attendants following behind, hearing strangers argue openly. Powerful environments often remove small freedoms first. Meanwhile, Ming emperors themselves vary dramatically. Some work obsessively through administrative burdens. Others withdraw almost entirely from governance, pursuing spiritual practices, pleasures, or isolation. One emperor becomes fascinated with Taoist immortality rituals and consumes dangerous elixirs much like rulers centuries earlier. Another refuses to meet ministers directly for years. The palace adapts around each personality. That flexibility keeps dynasties alive longer than logic sometimes predicts. You visit the Imperial Archives, where clerks preserve mountains of documents recording taxes, weather disasters, grain shipments, legal disputes, military reports, and ceremonial details. Paper fills entire rooms floor to ceiling. History survives partly because bureaucracies become obsessive record keepers. One archivist carefully dries damaged pages after accidental water exposure during a storm leak. His concentration appears almost devotional, perhaps preserving memory as a form of devotion. Beyond Beijing, the Ming Dynasty strengthens the Great Wall extensively against northern threats. Soldiers stationed along remote sections endure brutal winters isolated from families for years at a time. You stand atop the wall during one freezing night while snow sweeps across the mountains beneath moonlight. Guard fires flicker faintly in distant towers connected through darkness. A soldier wraps numb hands around a bowl of hot millet porridge while staring northward into empty blackness. Waiting becomes its own kind of labour. Back inside the Forbidden City, however, waiting carries different emotional weight. Waiting for promotion. Waiting for imperial favour. Waiting for dangerous rumours to fade. Waiting for footsteps outside your door after midnight. The palace glows beautifully tonight beneath falling snow. Golden roof tiles shimmer faintly under moonlight while guards patrol silent courtyards, with lanterns swaying beside them, and behind countless shuttered windows, human beings continue navigating ambition, fear, loneliness, and desire inside one of the most magnificent prisons ever constructed. The sea smells enormous at dawn. Salt wind whips across the harbour while ropes groan against wooden docks slick with morning mist. Sailors shout to one another above crashing waves. Somewhere nearby, a bronze bell rings through the fog as labourers haul crates of porcelain, silk, lacquerware, and tea toward waiting ships. Then the treasure fleet emerges slowly from the haze. At first you only notice towering shadows, then sails, then impossible size. The ships of Zheng He dwarf nearly everything around them. Massive multi-decked vessels stretch across the harbour like floating cities, their red banners snapping sharply in the ocean wind. Smaller escort ships cluster nearby carrying soldiers, translators, physicians, navigators, astrologers, interpreters, and merchants. The Ming Dynasty now looks outward toward the wider world with extraordinary confidence, and leading these voyages stands one of the most fascinating figures in Chinese history. Zheng He, born into a Muslim family in southwestern China during the final years of Mongol rule. He was captured as a child during Ming military campaigns and brought into imperial service as a eunuch. Over time, he rose through intelligence, discipline, and political loyalty until becoming one of the Yongle Emperor's most trusted officials. His life alone feels improbable enough for legend. You board one of the great ships before departure. The deck smells of wet wood, tar, sea salt, and packed spices stored below. Sailors climb rigging with astonishing speed despite the rolling tide beneath them. Officers inspect maps weighted against the wind with bronze instruments and ceramic cups. The atmosphere hums with nervous energy. Many aboard have never sailed beyond familiar coastal waters. Some never even saw the open ocean before joining the fleet. A young sailor grips the railing too tightly while staring toward the horizon. He tries disguising fear with jokes that convince nobody, including himself. Fair enough, honestly. The ocean terrifies human beings for good reason. When the fleet finally departs, the harbour erupts into movement. Drums beat rhythmically. Sailcloth snaps overhead. Families wave from crowded piers growing smaller behind drifting mist. China begins moving across the sea. The voyagers carry Ming influence through Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa. At each port, Zheng He's fleet arrives not merely as traders, but as floating demonstrations of imperial power. You enter bustling foreign harbours beside astonished local crowds watching the treasure ships anchor offshore. In Calicut, spice scents saturate the humid air. In Malacca, traders speak half a dozen languages at once beneath crowded awnings. In Aden, desert winds carry dust through marketplaces filled with incense and horses. The world feels startlingly interconnected again. Chinese silk exchanges hands beside Persian carpets, African ivory, Arabian perfumes, Indian pepper, and exotic animals destined for imperial courts back home. One giraffe eventually arrives in China, causing widespread fascination because many people believe it resembles a mythical killin. Human beings have always enjoyed confusing unfamiliar animals with magical creatures. Zheng He himself moves through diplomatic ceremonies with calm authority. He is physically imposing according to surviving descriptions, yet surprisingly measured in conversation. He understands court ritual deeply but also adapts to foreign customs with unusual skill. You watch him greeting local rulers beneath bright coastal sunlight while interpreters move carefully between languages. Gifts exchange hands, agreements form, musicians perform. Diplomacy often resembles theatre performed beside armed ships. Still, these voyages genuinely expand cultural knowledge. Sailors map coastlines. Merchants exchange technologies and ideas. Doctors observe unfamiliar medicines and foods. One Chinese cook aboard the fleet becomes obsessed with foreign citrus fruits after tasting them in southern ports. For weeks afterward, he attempts recreating unfamiliar flavors inside the ship kitchens with mixed success. Civilizations change partly through such small curiosities. At night aboard the treasure ships, lanterns sway gently above dark water while waves slap rhythmically against the hull. Sailors gamble with carved dice. Others write letters they may never successfully deliver home. One elderly navigator studies stars in silence from the upper deck. His face has weathered into something almost resembling driftwood. He trusts constellations more than politics. Probably wise. Yet even during these outward voyages, changes begin quietly inside the Ming court back home. The Yongle Emperor dies eventually. Court priorities shift. Conservative officials question the enormous expense of maritime expeditions. Why spend fortunes projecting power across distant oceans while threats still exist along northern frontiers? It is not an unreasonable question. Inside Beijing, scholar officials increasingly argue that stability comes through internal order rather than ambitious overseas displays. Confucian bureaucrats distrust the influence of eunuchs like Zheng He, whose success challenges traditional hierarchies. Political rivalry shapes exploration more often than curiosity alone. You return eventually to the Forbidden City where ministers debate maritime policy beneath heavy incense smoke and winter-grey skies. The atmosphere feels colder than before, less adventurous, more defensive. One official complains that merchants and sailors grow morally unreliable through excessive foreign contact. Another argues the empire already possesses everything truly valuable within itself. History later judges these attitudes harshly sometimes, though reality appears more complicated. Maintaining enormous fleets drains resources. Northern military threats remain serious. Court politics exhaust dynasties gradually. Still, something quietly closes during these years. The treasure voyages end, shipyards slow, records disappear, ocean ambitions fade. China does not become isolated completely. Despite later myths, trade continues robustly through private merchants and regional networks. Foreign goods still enter Chinese markets. Coastal cities remain commercially alive, yet the state itself turns inward again. You walk along a southern harbour decades after Zheng He's final voyages. Fishing boats rock gently beside worn docks where only smaller commercial vessels now gather. An old sailor sits repairing nets beneath fading afternoon light. He once served aboard one of the great treasure fleets during youth. Sometimes he still dreams about distant ports. Tall African coastlines glowing red at sunset. Indian markets overflowing with spice scents. Storms rolling across black oceans beneath impossible stars. His grandchildren barely believe such journeys happened. Memory shrinks quickly without institutions preserving it. Back in Beijing, the Ming court grows increasingly consumed by internal tensions. Factional struggles deepen. Eunuchs and scholars battle for influence. Emperors withdraw into isolation or obsession. Beyond the Great Wall, northern powers continue shifting restlessly. The empire feels secure tonight, perhaps, but not permanently secure. Nothing ever is. You stand one final evening beside the dark sea watching moonlight ripple across restless water, while fishing lanterns drift slowly near the horizon. Somewhere beyond that horizon lie ports once visited by Zheng He's fleets carrying silk, porcelain, ambition, and the confidence of an empire briefly convinced the world itself could be crossed and understood. Now the waves keep their silence again. Only the tide remains constant, pulling outward, returning inward, like history itself. Autumn rain falls softly across the palace roofs. You stand inside the Forbidden City during the final centuries of Imperial China while water slides from golden tiles into dark stone courtyards polished by generations of footsteps. The air smells faintly of wet cedar, coal smoke and old silk stored too long inside sealed rooms. The Ming Dynasty is gone now. Rebellion, corruption, famine, and military weakness eventually shattered it. In 1644, rebel forces entered Beijing while the last Ming emperor reportedly hanged himself on a hill overlooking the palace grounds. Soon afterward, another northern power crossed the Great Wall. The Manchus, and from conquest emerged China's final imperial dynasty, the Qing. At first, the new rulers appear foreign to many Han Chinese subjects, much as the Mongols once had. Qing men wear queue hairstyles enforced by law. Bannermen occupy privileged military positions. Resistance flares repeatedly across the empire, yet the Qing prove remarkably capable rulers for long stretches of time. Especially under emperors like Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, you enter the court of the Kangxi emperor during early winter. He rises before dawn for governance meetings and studies tirelessly despite already commanding enormous authority. Unlike some isolated rulers before him, Kangxi moves with energetic curiosity through the empire's affairs. He questions astronomers, consults scholars, reviews flood reports personally. The palace still contains ritual and fear, but also unusual intellectual vitality. Jesuit missionaries arrive bringing Western astronomy, mathematics, cartography, and mechanical clocks. Inside imperial workshops, Chinese craftsmen examine strange imported devices ticking softly beneath lantern light. One court artisan spends hours dismantling a European clock simply to understand how tiny gears create movement. Curiosity survives even inside rigid systems. Outside Beijing, the Qing Empire expands dramatically across Inner Asia. Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan fall under imperial authority through military conquest, diplomacy, or both. The empire reaches enormous territorial size, but expansion carries costs. You travel northwest beside Qing military convoys, crossing dry frontier landscapes beneath endless skies. Dustcoats, uniforms, and lips alike. Soldiers sleep lightly around campfires while cold wind sweeps across open grasslands. One officer unfolds a letter from home beside the fire. His daughter has begun learning poetry. He smiles while reading the line twice, then carefully folds the letter again before sleep. Human tenderness persists stubbornly even inside imperial machinery. Meanwhile, back in the prosperous eastern provinces, Qing China experiences remarkable population growth and economic vitality. Markets expand, cities flourish, tea, porcelain, and silk flow through global trade networks. You walk through Suzhou during springtime where canals shimmer beneath willow branches and merchant houses display astonishing wealth behind carved wooden gates. The city feels elegant, cultivated, almost delicate. Tea houses overflow with conversation. Scholars compose calligraphy beside garden ponds. Opera performances continue late into humid evenings, while lantern reflections tremble across dark water. A silk merchant's daughter practices the pipa near an open courtyard while servants prepare elaborate dinners for visiting clients from distant provinces. The Qing world at its height feels stable beyond imagination. That stability becomes dangerous eventually. Inside the Forbidden City, the Qianlong Emperor grows old, surrounded by unimaginable luxury and accumulated confidence. He commissions enormous artistic projects, collects paintings obsessively, writes thousands of poems, and presides over a court convinced of China's central importance within the world. Foreign envoys arrive bearing gifts, imperial ceremonies unfold flawlessly, tribute flows inward, yet beneath the polished grandeur, strain quietly deepens, corruption spreads, population pressures intensify, peasant hardships worsen in some regions, officials conceal problems to preserve appearances. History often punishes systems that mistake longevity for invulnerability. You visit a rural village during flood season where muddy water has swallowed entire fields beneath grey skies. Farmers salvage what little grain remains while local officials argue about tax quotas no one can realistically pay. An exhausted mother wrings river water from blankets while her children search debris for cooking tools washed away overnight. Far away in Beijing, court banquets continue uninterrupted. The emotional distance between rulers and ordinary suffering grows wider with each generation, and then foreign pressure begins arriving more aggressively from the sea. European merchants increasingly demand broader trade access. The British Empire, hungry for Chinese tea and frustrated by trade imbalances, expands opium smuggling into China at catastrophic scale. You walk through a southern port city where opium dens glow dimly behind narrow alleyways. The atmosphere feels heavy and sad. Sweet smoke, sweat, hopeless exhaustion. A dock worker sits slumped against a wall after spending wages his family desperately needed. Nearby, a young official argues angrily that foreign traders are poisoning the country deliberately. He is not entirely wrong. The Qing court attempts oppression. Britain responds militarily. The Opium Wars begin, and suddenly imperial confidence collides violently with industrial modern warfare. You witness Qing soldiers preparing outdated cannons along coastal defences, while British steamships loom offshore beneath dark clouds. Rain lashes the harbour. Nervous recruits grip weapons they barely trust. The imbalance becomes painfully obvious. Defeat follows defeat. Treaties force China open economically and politically in humiliating ways. Foreign concessions carve into coastal cities. Missionaries spread inland. Internal rebellions erupt simultaneously. Most catastrophically, the Taiping Rebellion. Civil war during the Taiping era kills millions. Entire provinces burn, cities empty. Families vanish into refugee columns stretching endlessly along ruined roads. You travel through devastated countryside afterward, where silence itself feels damaged. Burned temples stand roofless beneath pale skies. Untended fields grow wild with weeds. Human bones occasionally surface after heavy rain. One surviving farmer kneels quietly planting rice beside the ruins of his village anyway, because life insists on continuing even after unimaginable destruction. Inside the Forbidden City, the late Qing court retreats increasingly into ritual while crises multiply beyond the walls. Empress Dowager Cixi dominates politics through intelligence, manipulation, and survival instincts sharpened by decades of palace struggle. She fascinates and frustrates historians endlessly. You see her one evening watching opera performances beside glowing lanterns, while distant reports describe military defeats and foreign demands arriving from outside the capital. Perhaps she understands the danger fully. Perhaps nobody truly does anymore. By the early 20th century, Imperial China feels exhausted. Railways appear beside ancient canals. Foreign soldiers patrol treaty ports. Revolutionary ideas spread through schools and military academies. Young intellectuals debate nationalism, reform, revolution, constitutional monarchy, republicanism. The old dynastic certainty dissolves rapidly, and inside the Forbidden City, the child Emperor Puyi wanders enormous palace courtyards nearly empty of real authority. Fallen leaves scrape softly across stone beneath cold autumn winds. He is too young to understand fully. The empire surrounding him is ending. Soon revolution will arrive. Dynasties will disappear. Modern China will begin emerging through war, ideology, memory, and transformation. But tonight rain still falls gently across the ancient palace roofs, while lantern light flickers against walls built for emperors who believed heaven itself guaranteed permanence. Morning traffic hums above buried dynasties. You stand on a crowded street in modern China while bicycles glide past delivery scooters. Commuters hurry beneath glowing phone screens, and steam rises from breakfast stalls into pale dawn air. Somewhere nearby, a train rumbles beneath the city underground, and beneath all of it, layered invisibly below the concrete and glass, lie thousands of years of memory. Ancient walls, burned palaces, broken pottery, forgotten graves. History never fully leaves a place. It settles into it quietly. You walk through Xi'an, once Chang'an, where tourists photograph restored gates while elderly residents practice Tai Chi beneath trees planted near buried imperial roads. The morning smells comforting. Soy milk, sesame bread, rain on stone.